The entire terrace at Giuliano's went silent when the little girl appeared. Blood on her sneakers, terror in her eyes, screaming words that made 20 wealthy diners forget their expensive meals. "They're beating my mom to death." People froze, forks midair, glasses paused at lips, nobody moving to help. Then she did something that made every person there hold their breath. She ran straight to Van Doyle's table and grabbed his hand. Van Doyle. The man whose name made prosecutors nervous. The man you didn't approach unless you had a death wish. Everyone watched, waiting to see if he'd push the child away or worse. Instead, he stood, his eyes cold and calculating as he looked toward the alley, where a woman's cries had just stopped. What happened next became the story every witness would tell for the rest of their lives. If you're already hooked in, please like this video and hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is just as powerful. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Alright, let me take you through what went down that night. Chapter 1. The outdoor terrace of Giuliano's restaurant overlooked the harbor where million-dollar yachts bobbed like toys in bathwater. White tablecloths snapped gently in the evening breeze. Crystal glasses caught the golden light of the setting sun. Waiters moved between tables with practiced silence, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates with choreographed precision. Van Doyle sat alone at the corner table, his back to the stone wall, his eyes on everything. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been painted onto his frame. His dark hair was swept back, touched with gray at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than old. At 43, he'd earned every silver strand through decisions that kept him alive and his enemies buried. 3 men sat at nearby tables. They weren't eating. They weren't drinking. They were watching the approaches, scanning faces, noting exits. Nicholas stood closest, leaning against the terrace railing with the casual posture of someone enjoying the view, but his hand never strayed far from the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Van cut into his steak with surgical precision. The meat was perfect, blood red in the center, seared black on the edges. He chewed slowly, tasting nothing. Food was fuel. Pleasure was a luxury he'd stopped allowing himself years ago. "Mr. Doyle." A waiter approached with appropriate deference. "The chef wanted to know if everything is to your satisfaction." Van nodded once. The waiter disappeared. Across the terrace, a couple celebrated an anniversary. The woman laughed at something her husband said, the sound bright and genuine. Van watched them for a moment, trying to remember when he'd last heard laughter that wasn't calculated or forced. He couldn't. The harbor breeze shifted, carrying with it the salt smell of the ocean mixed with something else. Perfume. Sweat. Fear. Van's hand paused halfway to his mouth. Nicholas had straightened at the railing, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert in a heartbeat. The other 2 men moved subtly, hands disappearing inside jackets. Then she appeared. The little girl burst through the restaurant's interior doorway and onto the terrace like she'd been launched from a cannon. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, small for her age, with dark hair flying wild around her face. Her pink sneakers slapped against the stone tiles. Her yellow dress was torn at the shoulder and streaked with something dark that might have been dirt or might have been blood. She was screaming, "Help! Someone help! They're killing her!" 20 diners turned to stare. Forks froze midair. Conversations died. Even the waiters stopped moving, caught between training that said to intervene and instinct that said to stay out of family drama. The girl's eyes swept the terrace with desperate urgency, searching for something, someone, anything that might save whatever nightmare she was running from. Her gaze landed on Van. Perhaps it was the way he sat alone, while others huddled in couples and groups. Perhaps it was the stillness of his posture while everyone else shifted and murmured nervously. Perhaps it was the 3 men in dark suits who'd formed a subtle perimeter around his table, marking him as someone important, someone powerful, someone who could do something. Whatever the reason, she ran straight toward him. Nicholas moved to intercept, his bulk positioning between Van and the approaching child. But Van raised one hand, a gesture so slight it was almost invisible. Nicholas froze. The girl didn't slow down. She crashed into the side of Van's table hard enough to rattle his water glass. Her small fingers shot out and clamped around his hand where it rested on the white tablecloth. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by terror and adrenaline. "They're beating my mom to death." The words tore from her throat, raw and desperate. Tears streaked through the dirt on her face. "Please, the alley, they won't stop, please." Van looked down at the small hand gripping his. Her fingernails were broken. Dirt was caked under them. There were scratches across her knuckles like she'd been clawing at something or someone. The terrace had gone completely silent. Every eye was fixed on them. The anniversary couple stared with their forks frozen. A waiter stood motionless with a wine bottle tilted at a dangerous angle. Even the harbor breeze seemed to pause, waiting. Van's mind worked with the cold efficiency of a machine processing variables: a child in distress, a public location, witnesses, his reputation, the implications of action versus inaction, the cost of either choice. His eyes met the girl's. She stared back at him with a gaze that held more hope than any child should have to place in a stranger. She was shaking, her whole body vibrating like a wire stretched too tight. But she didn't let go of his hand. "Where?" Van's voice was quiet, controlled, carrying no emotion whatsoever. The girl's face lit up with desperate relief. She'd found someone who would listen. Someone who would act. Behind the restaurant. The alley by the dumpsters. "Please hurry." Her voice broke. "There's so much blood." Van set down his fork with deliberate care. He lifted his napkin, wiped his mouth, and folded the cloth precisely before placing it beside his plate. Then he stood. He was taller than most men, broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled power of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning how to hurt people efficiently. The girl had to tilt her head back to look up at him. She didn't let go of his hand. "Show me," Van said simply. The girl nodded frantically, and turned, pulling him toward the terrace exit. Van allowed himself to be led, his long strides easily matching her frantic pace. Behind him, Nicholas and the others fell into formation without being told, hands now openly resting on concealed weapons. As they passed the anniversary couple, Van heard the woman whisper urgently to her husband, "That's Van Doyle. Oh my God, that's Van Doyle." The husband's face went pale. "We need to leave. Now." Van ignored them. He'd stopped caring about his reputation's effect on civilians years ago. Fear was useful. It created space. It prevented problems before they started. The girl led him through the restaurant's interior, past the kitchen where chefs paused in their work to stare, past the maitre d' who opened his mouth to say something then wisely closed it again, and out through the service entrance. The alley behind Giuliano's was typical of the harbor district. Narrow, shadowed, lined with dumpsters that reeked of rotting seafood and kitchen waste. Graffiti covered the brick walls and layers of paint that told stories nobody wanted to read. And in the center of the alley, 3 men surrounded a woman. She was on the ground, curled into a defensive ball, her arms wrapped around her head. One man was kicking her ribs with methodical brutality. Another stood back, smoking a cigarette and watching with casual interest. The third was going through her purse, dumping its contents onto the filthy pavement. The woman wasn't screaming anymore. That was worse. Screaming meant fight. Silence meant the fight was almost over. The girl's grip on Van's hand tightened until her fingernails cut into his skin. "Mom," she whispered, the word barely audible. Van took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd witnessed and caused his share of violence. 3 attackers. No weapons visible, but that didn't mean they weren't armed. The woman was badly hurt but still moving, still breathing. The alley had one exit behind the men and the one they'd just come through. No witnesses except his own people. Clean. Contained. And about to become very complicated. One of the men, the one going through the purse, looked up. He saw Van standing at the alley's entrance with a little girl, clutching his hand. The man's face registered confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "Oh shit," the man breathed. He dropped the purse and straightened, his hand moving toward his waistband. The kicking stopped. The other 2 men turned, following their companion's gaze. All 3 froze when they saw who was watching them. Van said nothing. He simply stood there, one hand held captive by a terrified child, his expression carved from ice. Behind him, Nicholas and the others had formed a wall, blocking the alley's exit. The smoker dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Mr. Doyle." His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying very hard not to sound threatening or threatened. "This is private business. We're handling a situation." Van's eyes dropped to the woman on the ground. She'd uncurled slightly, lifting her head to look at her daughter. Her face was a mask of blood. Her left eye was swollen shut. Her lip was split and still bleeding. But when she saw her daughter standing there, holding the hand of Van Doyle, her expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and absolute terror. She knew who he was. Everyone in this city knew who he was. "Mama." The girl tried to pull free from Van's grip, tried to run to her mother. Van held her back gently but firmly. "Stay," he said quietly. The girl froze, looking up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Then she nodded and stayed. Van returned his attention to the three men. He studied them with the detachment of someone evaluating merchandise. The smoker was the leader, standing straighter, making decisions. The kicker was muscle, all bulk and brutality. The one who'd been going through the purse was nervous, his hand still hovering near his waistband where he probably had a knife or a cheap pistol. "Private business," Van repeated, his voice flat. "You call beating a woman unconscious in an alley private business?" "She owes money," the smoker said, gaining confidence when Van didn't immediately attack. "We're collecting a debt. It's legitimate." "To who?" The three men exchanged glances. The nervous one shifted his weight, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. The kicker crossed his arms, trying to look intimidating and failing now that someone bigger and more dangerous was watching. The smoker cleared his throat. "Billy Holcomb. She borrowed money from Mr. Holcomb. She didn't pay it back. We're here to deliver a message about the consequences of—" "Billy Holcomb," Van interrupted, "is a loan shark who preys on people with nowhere else to turn. He charges interest that would make the devil blush, and he sends animals to beat women in alleys when they can't pay." The smoker's jaw tightened. "Mr. Holcomb is a legitimate businessman. We're authorized." "You're authorized," Van said quietly, "to leave, now. Before I decide that the message Billy Holcomb needs delivered is about the consequences of operating in my city without my permission." The alley went completely silent. On the ground, the woman made a small sound, somewhere between a sob and a laugh. She knew what was happening. She'd just gone from being Billy Holcomb's problem to being Van Doyle's interest. In this city, that was like jumping from a house fire into the ocean during a hurricane. The nervous one broke first. "Look, man, we didn't know she was connected. Nobody told us she had protection. If we'd known—" "She doesn't have protection," Van said. "She has a daughter who was brave enough to ask for help. That's different." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of understanding about what kind of man she'd grabbed. Van took a single step forward. Just one. But it was enough to make all three men tense. "Last chance," Van said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Walk away now. Tell Billy Holcomb that Sherry Brennan's debt is forgiven. Tell him if he has a problem with that, he can come find me himself." The smoker opened his mouth to argue, saw something in Van's eyes, and closed it again. He nodded once, sharp and quick. "We're leaving, no problem. We'll deliver the message." The three men backed toward the far end of the alley, moving slowly, carefully, like people retreating from a predator. When they reached the corner, they turned and ran. Van waited until their footsteps faded completely before releasing the girl's hand. She immediately rushed to her mother, dropping to her knees beside the woman and wrapping her small arms around Sherry's shoulders. Mama, I found help. You're going to be okay. I found someone." Sherry pulled her daughter close with shaking arms, blood from her split lip staining the girl's yellow dress. She looked up at Van with eyes that held gratitude and terror in equal measure. "Thank you," she whispered. Then quieter, almost to herself, "God help us." Van looked down at them. Mother and daughter. Broken and terrified but alive. Because a little girl had grabbed his hand and begged for mercy in front of 20 witnesses who would spread the story across the city by morning. He'd just done something that would be talked about for years. Something that would be seen as weakness by his enemies and confusion by his allies. Something that went against every rule he'd built his empire on. Van Doyle, the man who ruled the harbor district with calculated brutality, had just stopped a beating to save a stranger. Nicholas appeared at his elbow. "Boss," he said quietly, urgently. "We need to clean this up. If word gets out—" "Word's already out," Van interrupted. 20 people saw what happened on that terrace. He looked back at Sherry and the girl. The woman was trying to stand and failing. Blood dripped from her face onto the filthy alley pavement. Van made a decision, another one that would have consequences he'd deal with later. "Get the car," he told Nicholas. "We're taking them somewhere safe. Boss, now." Nicholas disappeared. The other men shifted nervously, waiting for orders. Van crouched down so he was eye level with the little girl. She stared at him with a gaze that was far too old for her years. "What's your name?" Van asked. "Sophie," the girl whispered. "Sophie Brennan." "Sophie," Van repeated. "You did good. You were brave. Your mother is going to be fine. Because of you." "Because of you," Van corrected. "You didn't give up. You found help." Sophie looked at him with something like wonder. "You're Van Doyle. I heard those men at the restaurant say your name. Mama told me about you once. She said you were dangerous. Your mother was right. But you helped us." Van had no answer for that. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd helped them. Calculation said he should have ignored the child, finished his steak, and let Billy Holcomb's men handle their business. Reputation said showing mercy was showing weakness. But when Sophie had grabbed his hand and looked at him with those desperate, hoping eyes, something had shifted. Something he'd thought was dead had flickered back to life. He stood as headlights swept across the alley entrance. Nicholas pulled up in the black Mercedes. Engine purring quietly. The trunk popped open. Medical supplies, always prepared for emergencies. Van looked at Sherry. "Can you walk?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her bloody face. "I don't think so. My ribs." Van bent and lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest. She was lighter than she should be, all bones and terror. Sophie followed, her hand clutching the hem of his suit jacket. As Van carried Sherry toward the car, she whispered against his shoulder. "Why are you doing this?" Van didn't answer. He didn't know how. He just knew that 20 minutes ago, he'd been Van Doyle, the man everyone feared. Now he was Van Doyle, the man who'd stopped a beating to save a stranger, and nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 2. Behind bulletproof glass. The Mercedes glided through the city streets with the silent efficiency of a predator moving through darkness. Van sat in the back beside Sherry, who drifted into semi-consciousness, her breathing shallow and labored. Sophie was pressed against her mother's other side, one small hand gripping Sherry's fingers, the other clutching Van's jacket sleeve like an anchor. Nicholas drove with his eyes constantly checking the mirrors, watching for tails, for problems, for the consequences that always followed decisions like the one Van had just made. The other two men followed in a second vehicle, maintaining a careful distance. "Where are we going?" Sophie's voice was small, uncertain. "Somewhere safe," Van replied. "Somewhere the men who hurt your mother can't reach you." "Your house?" "Something like that." Sophie studied him with eyes that seemed to see too much. "Are you going to hurt us?" It was a fair question. A smart question. The kind of question that proved this child had learned early to assess threats and calculate survival. "No," Van said simply. "Then why are you helping us?" "Mama says nobody does things for free. She says everyone wants something." Van looked down at Sherry's battered face. The woman had taught her daughter well. Trust nothing. Expect nothing. Survival meant understanding that kindness always came with a price. "Your mother is right," Van said. "But sometimes the thing people want isn't what you'd expect." "What do you want?" Van was quiet for a moment. What did he want? He'd asked himself that question 1,000 times over the years and never found a satisfying answer. Power? He had it. Money? More than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Respect? Fear accomplished the same thing with less effort. "I want your mother to heal," he said finally. "I want you to stop being scared. That's all." Sophie absorbed this, her young mind working through the implications. For how long? What? How long do we get to stop being scared? Until tomorrow? Until next week? Until those men come back? Van met her gaze. This child understood the temporary nature of safety in a way most adults never had to learn. "For as long as it takes," Van said. It wasn't a promise he should make. Promises created obligations, and obligations created complications. But something about Sophie's desperate hope, demanded an answer that went beyond calculation. The Mercedes turned into an underground parking garage beneath a building that didn't advertise its existence. No signs, no markings, just a gray concrete structure that could have been anything. Nicholas pressed a remote, and a reinforced steel gate rolled open silently. They descended 3 levels into darkness, punctuated by security lights. When they finally stopped, they were in a private section sealed off from the rest of the garage by another gate, and a security door that required both a keycard and a fingerprint scan. "Stay here," Van told Sophie as he stepped out of the car. "I'll carry your mother." He lifted Sherry again, careful of her injured ribs. She stirred slightly, her one good eye opening to see Van's face inches from hers. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "You should have left us. Too late for that. Billy will come after you. Billy should worry about me coming after him." Sherry tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough that sprayed blood across Van's expensive shirt. He didn't flinch. Nicholas held the security door open, and they entered a private elevator that required yet another security code. The elevator rose smoothly, its walls mirrored, showing Van his reflection holding a broken woman while her daughter pressed close to his side. He looked like a monster carrying his victims. The thought didn't bother him as much as it should have. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor. The furniture was modern, expensive, and impersonal, the kind of space designed for function rather than comfort. A place to conduct business, to hide assets, to keep people who needed to disappear for a while. Van had owned it for 5 years, and had never slept here. "Guest bedroom," Van told Nicholas, who moved ahead to open doors. They entered a room with a king-sized bed, attached bathroom, and windows that had been replaced with bulletproof glass. Beautiful and fortified. Luxury and paranoia in equal measure. Van laid Sherry on the bed with surprising gentleness. She groaned as her body settled into the mattress, pain breaking through whatever adrenaline and shock had been keeping her functional. Sophie climbed onto the bed beside her mother, curling into Sherry's side with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly where the injuries were and how to avoid them. "Nicholas," Van said without turning. "Call Patrick Yang. Tell him I need him here in 20 minutes. Tell him to bring everything for broken ribs, lacerations, possible concussion. Patrick's going to ask questions. Patrick knows better than to ask questions." Nicholas left to make the call. Van stood beside the bed, looking down at mother and daughter. They fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Sophie's small form perfectly positioned against Sherry's larger one. Protection and protected, even now, even broken. "You should rest," Van said to Sherry. "A doctor is coming." "A doctor you trust?" Sherry's voice was weak but sharp. "A doctor who values his life enough not to talk about his patients." "That's not the same thing as trust." Van almost smiled. "Almost. No. But it's more reliable." Sherry closed her eye, exhausted by the effort of speaking. Sophie watched Van with unwavering attention, her mind clearly working through questions she wasn't asking out loud. "Are you hungry?" Van asked the girl. Sophie shook her head. "Thirsty." Another shake. "Scared?" Sophie hesitated, then nodded slowly. Van pulled a chair from the corner and sat, making himself less imposing by reducing his height advantage. "That's smart. Fear keeps you alert. But you're safe here. These walls are reinforced. The windows are bulletproof. The doors have locks that would take an hour to breach even with the right tools. Nobody gets in here unless I allow it." "What about getting out?" Sophie asked quietly. The question landed like a stone. This child understood prisons came in many forms, some with bars, some with luxury furniture and bulletproof glass. "You're not prisoners," Van said. "When your mother is healed, when it's safe, you can leave. And if it's never safe?" Van had no answer for that. Safety was relative. In his world, it was a temporary state that lasted only as long as the threats were managed and the power balance maintained. True safety didn't exist, just varying degrees of danger. "We'll make it safe," Van said instead. Sophie studied his face, searching for the lie, for the crack in his certainty. When she didn't find it, she nodded and turned her attention back to her mother, her small hand stroking Sherry's hair with heartbreaking tenderness. Van stood and moved to the window. The harbor spread out below, dotted with lights from boats and buildings. His city, his territory, his responsibility and his burden. 20 years ago, he'd been nobody. Just another kid from the wrong side of the harbor, watching his father drink himself to death and his mother work 3 jobs to keep them fed. He'd learned early that the world didn't care about fair. It cared about strong. So he'd gotten strong. He'd done things that still woke him sometimes in the dead of night, his hands remembering violence his mind tried to forget. He'd climbed over bodies to build his empire, literal and metaphorical. He'd earned his reputation one brutal choice at a time. And then a little girl had grabbed his hand and asked for help, and he'd thrown 2 decades of careful calculation away in seconds. "Boss." Nicholas appeared in the doorway. "Patrick's on his way." 10 minutes out. Van nodded. "Also," Nicholas continued, his voice carefully neutral, words already spreading. 3 people from the restaurant have posted on social media. Videos, photos. By morning, everyone's going to know what happened. Let them know." Nicholas shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Billy's going to hear about it. Good. Saves me the trouble of sending him a message. This could start something. It already started. Now we finish it." Nicholas was quiet for a moment. He'd worked for Van for 8 years, long enough to read the subtle signals, the slight changes in posture that indicated decisions had been made and arguing was pointless. "I'll have the men ready," Nicholas said finally. "Not yet. First, we make sure they're safe." Van nodded toward the bedroom where Sophie was softly singing something to her unconscious mother. "Then we deal with Billy." "Then, you're really going to war over a waitress and her kid?" Van turned from the window. "I'm going to war over the principle that Billy Holcomb doesn't get to beat women to death in my city without consequences. The waitress and her kid are just the excuse I needed. It was a lie. And they both knew it." Van had tolerated Billy's operation for years because it was small, contained, and didn't interfere with his own interests. The loan sharking, the violence, the exploitation. None of it had bothered him enough to act. Until Sophie had grabbed his hand. Until he'd looked into her desperate, hoping eyes and remembered another little girl from another lifetime. A sister who'd needed help that never came. A tragedy that shaped everything Van had become. "Get some rest," Van told Nicholas. "Tomorrow's going to be complicated." Nicholas left. Van returned to the bedroom doorway, watching Sophie curl against her mother. The girl had finally allowed herself to relax, her eyes closed, her breathing evening out, but her hands still clutched Sherry's fingers, maintaining that connection even in sleep. Van's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Heard you made a new friend at Giuliano's. Touching. Billy wants to talk." Van deleted the message without responding. Billy could want whatever he liked. Wanting and getting were 2 different things. Another text. This one from Lyle. His consigliere. "We need to discuss the implications of tonight. Call me." Van ignored that one too. Lyle would tell him everything he already knew. That helping Sherry was bad strategy. That showing mercy publicly undermined his reputation. That Billy would see it as weakness and respond accordingly. All true. All irrelevant now. The elevator chimed. Van moved into the living room as Patrick Yang emerged, carrying a black medical bag and wearing the expression of someone who'd been woken from sleep and told to come immediately. Patrick was in his early 50s, gray-haired, steady-handed, and smart enough to treat Van's people without asking questions about how they'd gotten injured. He'd removed bullets, treated stab wounds, and once reconstructed a face that had been badly beaten during a territorial dispute. "Where's the patient?" Patrick asked. Van led him to the bedroom. Patrick took one look at Sherry's battered face and swollen ribs and let out a low whistle. "She needs a hospital. She needs discretion. She needs both. Can you treat her here or not?" Patrick set his bag down and began pulling out supplies. "I can stabilize her. But if there's internal bleeding, if her ribs punctured anything important, she'll need surgery I can't perform in a penthouse. Then make sure she doesn't need surgery." Patrick shot Van a look that said he knew exactly how ridiculous that statement was, but he'd learned years ago that arguing with Van Doyle was an exercise in frustration. "The girl should leave the room," Patrick said, unpacking sterile supplies. "She stays. She doesn't need to see this. She's already seen worse." Patrick glanced at Sophie, who'd woken when they entered and was now watching him with wary eyes. "I'm a doctor," Patrick told her gently. "I'm going to help your mother. Are you going to hurt her? I'm going to hurt her a little to help her a lot. Sometimes that's how healing works. Sophie processed this, then nodded. Okay, but I'm staying. Patrick looked at Van, who shrugged. The doctor sighed and turned his attention to Sherry. What followed was 45 minutes of careful, precise medical work. Patrick cleaned the lacerations on Sherry's face, using tiny stitches that would leave minimal scarring. He examined her ribs, declaring 2 broken, but not displaced. He checked for signs of internal bleeding, breathing problems, neurological damage. Through it all, Sophie watched without flinching. When Sherry woke and cried out in pain as Patrick probed her injuries, Sophie took her mother's hand and whispered reassurances that sounded far too adult coming from a 7-year-old. Finally, Patrick stepped back. She'll live. The ribs will heal in 6 to 8 weeks. The cuts will scar but not badly. She's lucky. A few more kicks and we'd be having a very different conversation. When can she leave? Van asked. Leave? Patrick stared at him. She shouldn't move for at least a week. Even then, she'll need help with everything. Broken ribs don't heal fast. And they hurt like hell. A week, Van repeated, processing the implications. A week of having Sherry and Sophie in his space. A week of exposure, of vulnerability, of caring about whether 2 strangers lived or died. At minimum, Patrick confirmed. And that's if nothing goes wrong. He began packing his supplies. I'll come back tomorrow to check on her. If her condition changes, if she develops fever or breathing problems, call me immediately. I will. Patrick paused at the door. Van. Whatever this is, whatever you're doing, be careful. People like us don't get to play hero without consequences. I'm not playing hero. Then what are you doing? Van looked back at the bedroom where Sophie sat vigil over her sleeping mother. I'm not sure yet. Patrick left. Van stood alone in the living room, watching the city lights reflect off the bulletproof windows, and wondered how a simple dinner had turned into this. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Last chance to make this right. Return the woman. Tell her the debt stands. Walk away. Van stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. The debt is forgiven. She's under my protection now. If you have a problem with that, come find me yourself. He hit send and turned off his phone. Tomorrow, Billy would make his move. Tomorrow, there would be consequences and complications. Tomorrow, Van would have to prove that protecting Sherry and Sophie wasn't the weakness his enemies thought it was. But tonight, he'd done something that felt right for the first time in years, and that would have to be enough. Chapter Trey. A dangerous proposition. Van didn't sleep. He never slept well, but tonight was worse than usual. He sat in the living room with all the lights off, watching the harbor through bulletproof glass while his mind calculated variables and consequences. By dawn, his phone had 17 missed calls. Lyle had called 6 times. Nicholas 3. The others were numbers he recognized but didn't feel like acknowledging. People wanting to know what Van was thinking. People wanting to offer advice he wouldn't take. People wanting to position themselves for whatever came next. At 6 in the morning, Van finally turned his phone back on. The messages flooded in immediately. He ignored most of them, and opened the one from Lyle. We need to meet. Now. This situation with Billy is escalating faster than you think. Van typed back. My office. 1 hour. He stood and stretched, his back protesting the night spent in a chair. Through the bedroom door, he could hear Sophie's soft breathing, and the occasional groan from Sherry as she shifted in sleep, and her broken ribs reminded her of their existence. Van moved to the kitchen and started coffee. The ritual was calming, familiar. Measure the grounds, add the water, wait for the machine to work its magic. Simple cause and effect. Unlike everything else in his life right now. You're still here. Van turned. Sophie stood in the kitchen doorway, wearing the same yellow dress from yesterday, now stained with her mother's blood and alley dirt. Her dark hair was tangled around her face. She looked exhausted and weary and far too old for 7. Did you think I'd leave? Van asked. Sophie shrugged. Mama says people always leave. She says that's the one thing you can count on. Your mother has had a hard life. Is that why those men hurt her? Because life was already hard, and they wanted to make it harder? Van had no good answer for that. He pulled a second mug from the cabinet and filled it with milk, warming it slightly in the microwave before handing it to Sophie. People hurt other people for lots of reasons, Van said carefully. Sometimes because they're angry. Sometimes because they're scared. Sometimes just because they can. Sophie wrapped her small hands around the warm mug. Which one were those men? The last kind. They hurt your mother because Billy told them to, and they could, and nobody was there to stop them. Until you. Until you, Van corrected. You're the one who ran for help. You're the one who didn't give up. Sophie sipped her milk, considering this. Mama's going to be mad at me when she wakes up properly. She told me never to talk to strangers. Especially not men like you. Men like me? Dangerous men. Men who hurt people. Van sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for Sophie to join him. She did, perching on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to fly at the first sign of threat. Your mother is right to teach you that, Van said. Most of the time staying away from dangerous men is the smart choice. But not yesterday? Yesterday was different. Yesterday, you needed help more than you needed to be careful. Sophie absorbed this, her young mind working through the logic. Are you going to hurt the men who hurt my mama? It was a direct question that deserved an honest answer. Van could lie, could soften the truth, could tell her what adults usually told children about violence and consequences. But Sophie had already seen too much to believe comfortable lies. Yes, Van said simply. Good. Sophie's voice was flat, cold. The word carried weight that no 7-year-old should understand. I hope you make them scared first. I hope they cry like Mama cried. Van looked at this small girl, radiating rage, and recognized something he'd felt at her age, the helpless fury of watching someone you love suffer and being unable to stop it. That anger could destroy you or forge you into something harder. Sophie, Van said quietly, what those men did was wrong. What I'm going to do to them might also be wrong. But sometimes wrong things happen to wrong people, and the world is better for it. That doesn't make sense. No. But it's true anyway. A sound from the bedroom drew their attention. Sherry was awake, calling for Sophie with a voice tight with pain. Sophie slid off the chair and ran to her mother. Van followed more slowly, giving them a moment before appearing in the doorway. Sherry was propped against the pillows, one arm wrapped around her daughter. Her face looked worse in the morning light, the bruises fully developed now, showing purple and black and sickly yellow around the edges. Her left eye was still swollen shut. Where are we? Sherry asked, her voice hoarse. Somewhere safe, Van replied. Sherry's one good eye found him, and recognition sparked. You're really Van Doyle. I thought maybe I'd hallucinated that part. Not a hallucination. Why? Why would you help us? We're nobody to you. It was the same question everyone was asking. Van was getting tired of not having a good answer. Your daughter asked for help. I provided it. That's all. That's not all. Sherry's voice gained strength despite the pain. Men like you don't help people out of kindness. You want something. Everyone wants something. Van leaned against the doorframe. What could you possibly have that I'd want? I don't know. But I'll figure it out eventually. And when I do, I'll know what this really costs. She was smart. Damaged and desperate, but smart. Van could work with smart. Right now, it costs nothing, Van said. You heal. Your daughter stays safe. When you're ready, we discuss what happens next. And if I want to leave now, you can't walk. You can barely breathe, and Billy's men are looking for you. Sherry's face went pale. Billy knows? By now, the whole city knows. I made sure of it. Why would you do that? Sherry's voice rose, panic cutting through the pain. You just painted a target on both of us. The target was already there. I just made sure everyone knows you're under my protection now. I didn't ask for your protection. No, your daughter did. Sherry looked at Sophie, who was pressed against her side, silent tears streaming down her face. The woman's expression cycled through anger, fear, and finally resignation. I can't pay you, Sherry whispered. Whatever you think this is worth, I can't pay it. I don't want your money. Then what? Van was quiet for a long moment. What did he want? He still didn't have a clear answer. He just knew that walking away wasn't an option anymore. I want Billy to understand that there are rules in this city, Van said finally. And beating women to death in alleys breaks those rules. You never cared before. Billy's been doing this for years. I'm caring now. Sherry studied his face, searching for the angle, the manipulation, the trap. When she didn't find it, confusion replaced suspicion. I don't understand you, she said. You don't have to. You just have to heal. Van's phone buzzed. A text from Nicholas. Billy's people are at the restaurant. They're asking questions, getting aggressive. Van typed back. Let them ask. Don't engage. Another text. This one from Lyle. Where are you? We need to talk before this gets worse. Van pocketed the phone. I have to leave for a few hours. Nicholas will be here. If you need anything, ask him. We're prisoners then, Sherry said bitterly. You're protected. There's a difference. Not from where I'm sitting. Van couldn't argue with that. From Sherry's perspective, she'd traded one trap for another, Billy's violence for Van's control. Neither offered real freedom. Rest, Van told her. We'll talk more when I get back. He left before she could respond, moving through the apartment with purpose. Nicholas was in the living room, checking his weapon with mechanical efficiency. Status? Van asked. 3 of Billy's guys showed up at Giuliano's an hour ago. They're questioning staff, showing photos of the woman and kid. The manager called to warn us. Good. That means Billy's worried. Boss, this is escalating fast. Billy's not going to back down from this. You publicly humiliated him. He publicly beat a woman. I'd say we're even. Nicholas holstered his weapon. With respect, we're not even. You stepped into his operation without warning. You took his target. You told his men to deliver a message that basically declared war. Billy can't ignore that without looking weak. Then he shouldn't have operated in my city without remembering whose city it is. Van moved to the elevator, Nicholas following. They descended to the parking garage where the Mercedes waited like a patient predator. Van's office was downtown, occupying the top floor of a building he owned through 3 shell corporations. The view rivaled the penthouse, but the atmosphere was different. This was a workspace, functional and efficient. No comfort, no decoration, just power concentrated in glass and steel. Lyle was already there when Van arrived, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows like a caged animal. He was older than Van by a decade, gray-haired and distinguished, wearing a suit that cost as much as a decent car. He'd been Van's consigliere for 15 years, offering advice that Van usually took and criticism that Van usually ignored. Finally, Lyle said when Van entered. Do you have any idea what kind of chaos you caused last night? Van moved to his desk and sat. I saved a woman from being beaten to death. That's not chaos. That's intervention. That's politics. Lyle's voice rose. Everything we do is politics. You know that. And last night, you made a political statement that half the city is interpreting as weakness, and the other half is interpreting as a power play against Billy. Maybe it's both. Lyle stared at him. Are you telling me this was planned? That you intentionally created a situation that puts us at odds with Billy's operation? No. But I'm not going to pretend I regret it either. Lyle sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs facing Van's desk. Tell me about the woman. Who is she? What's her connection to you? She doesn't have a connection. Her daughter asked for help. I provided it. That's it? That's the whole story? That's the whole story. Lyle was quiet for a long moment, studying Van's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read his tells over 15 years of association. You're telling me you started what might become a war with Billy Holcomb over a stranger and her kid? No angle, no strategy, no calculation. Yes. I don't believe you. I don't care. Lyle leaned forward. Van. I've known you since you were nobody. I watched you build this empire one careful decision at a time. You don't do impulsive. You don't do mercy. You don't risk everything for people who can't help you. Maybe I'm changing. Men like us don't change. We adapt. We evolve, but we don't fundamentally change. Van was tired of this conversation. Tired of defending a decision he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Billy sent men to beat a woman to death in my territory, Van said flatly. He did it publicly, in an alley behind one of my restaurants, without asking permission or paying respect. That's not just about the woman. That's about Billy thinking he can operate however he wants without consequences. So this is about territory. Everything is about territory. Lyle seemed to accept this explanation more readily than the truth. Territory, power, respect, these were concepts he understood. Mercy for strangers was foreign language. Okay, Lyle said. If we're doing this, if we're really going to move against Billy, we need to do it smart. We need leverage. I'm listening. Billy operates through fear. He loans money at impossible rates, and when people can't pay, he makes examples of them. But his whole operation depends on people being more afraid of him than they are of whoever might protect them. And now they know I'll protect them. Exactly. If word spreads that you intervened for a random waitress, Billy's business model collapses. Why pay impossible debts when you can run to Van Doyle instead? Van hadn't thought of it that way, but Lyle was right. By protecting Sherry, Van had accidentally undermined Billy's entire operation. So what do? Van asked. We make it formal. We announce that anyone who borrowed from Billy can come to us instead. We'll buy out their debts at fair rates. Billy loses his portfolio. And we gain goodwill from people who'll remember we helped them. It was smart strategy wrapped in appearing like mercy. Classic Lyle. Do it, Van said. There's a problem. Billy won't go quietly. He'll see this as an attack, which it is. He'll respond with violence. Let him. Van. I said let him. Billy makes a move, we respond. He escalates, we escalate harder. Eventually, he'll understand that operating in this city requires my permission. Lyle stood. I hope you know what you're doing. So do I. After Lyle left, Van sat alone in his office, looking out at the city he'd spent 20 years claiming. From up here, it looked peaceful. Ordered. Beautiful, even. But Van knew better. Down there in the streets, in the alleys, in the shadows between buildings, violence was always simmering. Territory disputes, power struggles, desperate people making desperate choices. He'd been one of those desperate people once. A kid with nothing, watching his mother work herself to exhaustion while his father drowned in bottles. He'd learned early that the world was divided into those who took and those who got taken from. So he'd learned to take, and he'd gotten very, very good at it. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being the desperate kid fighting for survival and become something else, something harder, something that frightened people just by existing. Van's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. Doyle. The voice was smooth, confident. Billy Holcomb. I think we need to have a conversation. I'm listening. Face to face. Tonight. Neutral ground. Just you and me. Discussion between businessmen. Where? The old warehouse on Pier 9. 9 o'clock. Come alone. Van almost laughed. The warehouse was Billy's territory, and coming alone was suicide. I'll be there, Van said, but I'm bringing Nicholas. You can bring one person too. Even numbers, even odds. Billy was quiet for a moment. Fair enough. 9 o'clock. Don't be late. The line went dead. Van sat back in his chair, mind already working through scenarios. Billy wanted to talk, which meant he was worried. Good. Worried people made mistakes. But worried people were also dangerous. And Billy hadn't survived this long by being stupid. Tonight would determine whether this situation could be resolved with words, or if it would require the kind of resolution that left bodies behind. Van hoped for the former but prepared for the latter. Chapter 4. Walking into the lion's den. Van spent the afternoon preparing. Not just for the meeting with Billy, but for the possibility that the meeting was a trap designed to end with Van's body floating in the harbor. He returned to the penthouse at 4 to check on Sherry and Sophie. Patrick had come and gone, leaving instructions and more pain medication. Sherry was awake but groggy, her body fighting the twin battles of healing and pharmaceuticals. Sophie sat beside her mother's bed, reading aloud from a children's book Nicholas had somehow procured. How is she? Van asked from the doorway. Sophie looked up. Better. The doctor said her ribs are healing right. No infection. Van nodded. Good. Sherry's one good eye focused on him with difficulty. You're leaving again. I have a meeting. With Billy. It wasn't a question. Somehow, Sherry had figured it out. Or maybe Nicholas had mentioned it. Or maybe she just understood how these situations worked. Yes, Van confirmed. He's going to kill you. He's going to try. Sherry struggled to sit up, wincing with pain. Then don't go. Stay here. Let this whole thing blow over. It won't blow over. Billy can't let this stand. I publicly undermined his authority. He has to respond or lose everything. So let him lose everything. Why do you have to walk into an obvious trap? Van moved into the room, pulling the chair closer to the bed so he could sit at eye level with Sherry. Sophie watched their exchange with the intensity of someone learning how adult conversations worked. Because if I don't go, Billy will think I'm afraid, Van explained. Fear breeds aggression. He'll come after you, after me, after anyone he thinks is weak. But if I go, if I meet him on his terms and walk away, I prove that I'm not afraid of him. And if you don't walk away, then Nicholas knows what to do. Sherry's face crumpled. This is my fault. You're risking your life because I couldn't pay back a loan. No. I'm risking my life because I chose to intervene. That's on me, not you. Why? The question came out as a whisper. Why choose this? Why choose us? Van looked at Sophie, who was watching him with those two old eyes, waiting for an answer that made sense of the chaos adults created. 20 years ago, my sister was Sophie's age, Van said quietly. It was a story he never told, a wound he never exposed. But something about this moment demanded honesty. She got sick. We didn't have money for doctors. My mother worked 3 jobs, but it wasn't enough. My father drank away what little we had. He paused, the memory sharp even after 2 decades. I tried to get help. I went to everyone I could think of. Churches, charities, the people my father owed money to. Nobody would help. Nobody thought one poor girl was worth the effort. She died, Sophie said softly, not a question. A recognition of how these stories always ended. She died, Van confirmed. And I swore that if I ever had power, I'd use it differently. That if I saw someone defenseless being hurt, someone who mattered even though the world pretended otherwise, I'd stop it. The room was silent except for the distant sound of harbor traffic and seagulls. Her name was Lily, Van continued. She liked yellow dresses, like the one Sophie was wearing yesterday. Understanding bloomed across Sherry's face. The yellow dress, the desperate child, the echo of a tragedy that had shaped the man sitting beside her bed. I'm sorry, Sherry whispered. Don't be. Just heal. Make sure your daughter has the chance mine didn't. Van stood, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. He was Van Doyle again, controlled and dangerous, the man who ruled through fear and calculation. Nicholas will stay here, Van told them. If anything happens, if Billy's people somehow find this place, Nicholas will get you out. There's a panic room behind the bookshelf in the living room. The code is Sophie's birthday. How do you know my birthday? Sophie asked. I know everything I need to know. It wasn't entirely true, but it sounded good. Actually, Van had asked Patrick to check Sophie's medical records when he'd examined Sherry. Details mattered. Preparation saved lives. Van left the bedroom and found Nicholas in the living room, cleaning his weapon for the 3rd time that day. It was nervous ritual, something to do with hands that wanted to be useful. Ready? Van asked. Nicholas looked up. As ready as I'll ever be to walk into a building where Billy probably has a dozen guns pointed at the entrance. Then we better not use the entrance. They took the Mercedes, Nicholas driving while Van sat in the back going over the warehouse layout in his mind. He'd been there once, years ago, for a meeting with the previous owner before Billy had bought it through intimidation and violence. The building had multiple access points, a basement that connected to the sewer system, and a roof that was accessible from the adjacent building. Billy would expect them to come through the front. Smart money said they'd use the back. Van planned to use the roof. They parked 3 blocks away, approaching the warehouse district on foot. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Appropriate, given what might happen in the next few hours. Boss, Nicholas said quietly as they moved through the shadows between buildings. If this goes bad, if Billy makes a move, what's the play? We survive. Whatever it takes. And if we don't? Van glanced at him. You've got instructions. The money for Sherry and Sophie is already set aside. Make sure they get somewhere safe, somewhere Billy can't reach. Nicholas nodded. They'd worked together long enough that elaborate explanations weren't necessary. Instructions were given. Instructions would be followed. They reached the building adjacent to the warehouse, a condemned factory that the city kept threatening to demolish. The door was chained, but chains were easy to cut when you came prepared. They entered quietly, moving through darkness filled with the ghosts of industrial work that would never return. The stairs to the roof were rusted but solid. They climbed carefully, weapons drawn, every sense alert for the ambush that might be waiting. But the roof was empty. Just gravel, old ventilation equipment, and the kind of silence that came from being above the city's constant noise. Van moved to the edge, looking down at the warehouse. Lights were on inside, visible through grimy windows. He could see movement. Shadows of people waiting. 3 on the ground floor, Nicholas observed, using binoculars to scout. 2 on the catwalk, 1 at the back entrance, plus whoever's with Billy in the office. 7 total that we can see. Against 2 of us. I love these odds. Van almost smiled. Nicholas had been in worse situations. They both had. The roof of the warehouse was 10 feet lower than the factory roof, and 6 feet across the gap. An easy jump for someone who'd spent a lifetime running across rooftops to escape or pursue. Van backed up, getting a running start. He hit the edge and flew, landing hard on the warehouse roof with a thud that was probably audible inside. Nicholas followed a second later, his bulk making the landing sound like thunder. They froze, waiting to see if anyone had heard. When no alarms sounded and no one came to investigate, they moved to the roof access door. Locked. But locks were temporary obstacles when you knew what you were doing. Van pulled out the small toolkit he always carried, and worked on the lock with practiced efficiency. 30 seconds later, the door swung open silently. They descended internal stairs, moving through darkness toward the light and voices below. The warehouse office was on the 2nd floor, a space with glass windows that overlooked the main floor. Perfect for observation, terrible for defense. Van could see Billy now, sitting behind a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from better times. He was younger than Van expected, maybe 35, with the kind of face that probably smiled easily when it wasn't conducting business that involved breaking bones. Another man stood beside Billy, thick-necked and alert, the bodyguard Van had expected. Van and Nicholas reached the office door. Through the glass, Van could see the 6 men positioned around the warehouse floor, trying to look casual and failing. They were expecting Van to come through the front, which meant they'd position themselves accordingly. Amateur mistake. Never assume your enemy will do the expected. Van opened the office door and walked in like he owned the place. Billy jerked in surprise, his hand moving toward the drawer where he probably kept a weapon. The bodyguard spun, reaching for his gun. I wouldn't, Nicholas said quietly, his weapon already drawn and pointed at the bodyguard's head. Billy's hand stopped moving. The bodyguard froze. Mr. Doyle, Billy said, recovering his composure with impressive speed. Creative entrance. I was expecting you to use the door like civilized people. Civilized people don't set traps. Van replied, moving to stand across the desk from Billy. You have 6 men positioned to ambush me if this conversation goes wrong. That's not civilized, that's predictable. Billy had the grace to look embarrassed. Can you blame me for being careful? You did steal my target and humiliate my men. Your target is a woman who borrowed money to pay for her daughter's medical bills. Your terms were predatory. Your response to non-payment was attempted murder. That's business. That's cruelty, disguised as business. Billy leaned back in his chair, studying Van with calculating eyes. You've never cared before. I've been operating in this district for 3 years. You've never said a word about my methods. I'm saying something now. Why? What's different about this woman? Van could have lied, could have spun some story about territory and respect and business boundaries. But he was tired of lying, tired of pretending his decisions were always calculated. Her daughter reminds me of someone I couldn't save, Van said simply. So I'm saving her instead. Billy absorbed this, and something like understanding crossed his features. You're doing this for sentiment. Actual sentiment. Call it whatever you want. You realize this makes you look weak, right? Powerful men don't change their policies because a little girl asks nicely. Powerful men do whatever they want, Van countered. I want to protect Sherry Brennan and her daughter. I want to make sure you understand that your operation has limits. I want those things more than I want your approval or anyone else's." Billy was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer, slowly, carefully, and pulled out not a weapon but a file folder. He tossed it across the desk to Van. "Sherry Brennan," Billy said. 32 years old. Works at Mario's Diner on 5th. Single mother. Borrowed $5,000 18 months ago to pay for her daughter's appendectomy. Agreed to pay back $7,000 over 2 years. Made 6 payments, then stopped. Van opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Payment schedules, loan agreements, collection notes, all meticulously documented. "She owed me $2,000, Billy continued. "That's all. $2,000. That's what you're willing to start a war over?" "I'm willing to start a war over you thinking attempted murder is an appropriate collection strategy. I never told my men to kill her. I told them to scare her, to make her understand that debts have consequences. Your men were kicking her in the ribs when I found her. She wasn't screaming anymore because she couldn't breathe. That's not scare tactics. That's attempted murder." Billy's jaw tightened. "Maybe they got overzealous. Maybe you hired animals and pointed them at vulnerable people." The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Nicholas kept his weapon trained on the bodyguard, who kept very still, recognizing that sudden movements would end badly for everyone. "So what now?" Billy asked. "You kill me? Take over my operation? Prove you're the biggest monster in the room?" Van sat down in the chair across from Billy's desk. Nicholas shifted position to maintain line of sight on both Billy and his bodyguard. "Here's what happens," Van said. "Sherry's debt is forgiven. All of it. You don't send anyone after her. You don't try to collect. You forget she exists. That sets a terrible precedent. I don't care. Second, anyone else who owes you money can come to me. I'll buy out their debts at fair rates. You get your money, they get reasonable repayment terms, everyone walks away happy." Billy laughed, the sound bitter. "You're destroying my business and calling it compromise. I'm giving you the chance to walk away with your life and your capital. That's more generous than you deserve. And if I refuse?" Van leaned forward. "Then I stop being generous. I shut down your operation completely. I buy every property you use for meetings. I pay off every cop you've bribed. I make it so you can't operate in this city at all. And then, when you're desperate and alone, I'll come for you." The silence that followed was heavy with calculation. Billy was weighing his options, measuring his chances, trying to find an angle that let him maintain power and pride. "You'd really do all that over $2,000 and some sentiment about a dead sister?" Billy asked quietly. "Yes." Billy studied Van's face and saw the truth there. This wasn't negotiation, it was declaration. Van had already made his decision. Billy could accept the terms or face the consequences. "I'll need guarantees," Billy said finally. "Assurances that you won't move against me once you've taken my portfolio. You have my word." "Your word." Billy laughed again, but this time it sounded more like acceptance than mockery. "Van Doyle's word. I suppose that's worth something in this city. It's worth more than your threats." Billy nodded slowly. "Fine. Sherry Brennan's debt is forgiven. I'll send you the list of my other debtors by tomorrow. We'll work out fair buyout terms. But Van? This makes us even. You interfere with my business again, and there won't be a meeting. There won't be negotiations. There'll just be war." "Understood." Van stood. The meeting was over. He'd gotten what he came for without bloodshed, which was more than he'd expected when he'd walked through that door. "One more thing," Billy said as Van turned to leave. "Why did you really come here tonight? You could have sent an intermediary. You could have made these demands through Lyle or Nicholas. But you came yourself. Walked into what you knew was probably a trap." "Why?" Van looked back at Billy. "Because if I'm asking you to respect my protection of Sherry and Sophie, I need to show that I'm willing to risk something for them. Words are cheap. Actions matter. You're either the smartest man I've ever met, or the most foolish. Probably both." Van and Nicholas left the way they'd come, climbing back up to the roof and across the gap to the factory. They didn't speak until they were 3 blocks away, back in the Mercedes with the engine running and the warehouse disappearing behind them. "That went better than expected," Nicholas said. Billy's smart enough to know when he's outmaneuvered. He'll honor the deal. And if he doesn't, then we'll deal with it, but I think he will. He understands that this city has rules now, and those rules include not killing people I've claimed. They drove back to the penthouse in silence. Van's phone buzzed with a message from Lyle. Heard the meeting went well. I'm impressed. Maybe this wasn't such a disaster after all. Van pocketed the phone without responding. The meeting had gone well. Billy had backed down. Sherry and Sophie were safe. But Van couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, not the end. He'd changed something fundamental tonight, not just in his relationship with Billy but in how the entire city would view him. Van Doyle, the man who ruled through fear, had just shown mercy, had just risked his life for strangers, had just proven that sentiment could drive decisions as powerfully as strategy. The consequences of that revelation would ripple outward for months, maybe years. When they reached the penthouse, Van found Sophie asleep in the chair beside her mother's bed, still clutching the children's book. Sherry was awake, her one good eye fixed on the door, waiting. "You're alive," she said when Van entered. Disappointed, relieved, and confused, and still terrified, but mostly relieved. Van moved to check the medical monitors Patrick had left. Sherry's vitals were stable, her pain was managed, her body was healing. "Billy agreed to forgive your debt," Van said. "You're safe now." Sherry closed her eye, tears leaking from beneath the swollen lid. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you, but thank you. Take care of your daughter. That's thanks enough." Van left them to rest and moved to the living room windows. The city spread out below, millions of lights representing millions of lives. Most of them would never know his name. Most would never care about the power struggles and territorial disputes that shaped their safety. But Sherry would know. Sophie would remember. And maybe that was enough. Van Doyle had spent 20 years building an empire on fear and calculation. Tonight, he'd discovered that mercy could be just as powerful. And tomorrow, he'd find out what that revelation cost him. Chapter 5, The Price of Protection. 3 days passed in cautious peace. Billy honored the agreement, sending over his debtor list along with detailed accounting that proved he was serious about the buyout. Lyle negotiated terms that were favorable to Van's organization while giving Billy enough profit to save face. The arrangement would cost Van roughly $200,000, a number that seemed absurd for what had started with a little girl grabbing his hand. But Van didn't regret it. Sherry improved steadily. The swelling around her eye decreased enough that she could open it partially. The bruises faded from black to purple to yellow-green. She could sit up without gasping, could walk to the bathroom without assistance, could eat solid food without wanting to vomit from pain. Sophie remained vigilant, rarely leaving her mother's side except when Nicholas coaxed her away with promises of hot chocolate or stories about his own daughters. The girl was intelligent, observant, and far too serious for 7 years old. She watched Van with constant curiosity, trying to understand the man who'd crashed into their lives like a storm and somehow become their protector. On the 4th morning, Van arrived at the penthouse to find Sophie waiting by the elevator, dressed in clean clothes that Nicholas had purchased. Her hair was brushed and pulled back with a yellow ribbon that matched her new dress. "Mama wants to talk to you," Sophie announced. "She says it's important." Van followed her to the bedroom where Sherry sat propped against pillows, looking more alert than she had since the alley. The medical equipment had been reduced to a single monitor tracking her heart rate and blood oxygen. Patrick had declared her past the critical stage, healing on schedule. "You wanted to see me?" Van asked from the doorway. Sherry gestured to the chair. "Sit, please. I need to discuss what happens next." Van sat. Sophie climbed onto the bed beside her mother, taking up her usual protective position. "I've been thinking," Sherry began, "about the debt I owe you now. You don't owe me anything. Don't insult me by pretending this is charity. You've spent money on medical care, clothes for Sophie, food, security. You've risked your reputation and possibly your life. That's not nothing. It's handled. But how do I pay you back?" Sherry's voice carried frustration mixed with determination. "I'm a waitress. I make minimum wage plus tips. Even if I worked every day for the next 10 years, I couldn't repay what you've done." Van was quiet, unsure how to respond. He'd helped them because Sophie had asked, because something in that moment had bypassed his usual calculations. He hadn't thought about repayment, because he hadn't framed it as a transaction. "You don't pay me back," Van said finally. "You rebuild your life. You make sure Sophie has opportunities you didn't. That's enough." "It's not enough for me." Sherry leaned forward, wincing slightly as her ribs protested. "I need to contribute something. I need to feel like I'm not just a charity case you'll eventually resent." "I don't do resentment, I make decisions and live with them. Everyone resents being taken advantage of eventually." Van studied Sherry's face. She was proud despite her circumstances, determined despite her injuries. She needed to feel useful, needed to maintain dignity in a situation that had stripped away almost everything else. "What are you proposing?" Van asked. "Let me work for you. Nothing illegal," Sherry added quickly. "I'm not asking to join your organization or whatever you call it, but you must have legitimate businesses. Restaurants, maybe? I have 10 years of experience in food service. I can manage a kitchen, handle inventory, train staff. Let me earn my keep." It was a reasonable request. Van did own several restaurants through various holding companies. Most were covers for other activities, but they still needed to function as actual businesses to maintain appearances. "Patrick says you need 6 more weeks before you can work full-time," Van said. "Then I'll start part-time, light duty, whatever you need." Van glanced at Sophie, who was watching the exchange with intense focus. The girl understood that her mother was negotiating for their future, trying to convert charity into employment, dependence into independence. "I own a place called Dominic's on the waterfront," Van said. "Italian food, upscale clientele. The manager is reliable but overwhelmed. She could use an assistant, someone who knows the restaurant business." Sherry's face lit up with hope and relief. "When can I start?" "When Patrick clears you. Not before." "Deal." They shook hands. Sherry's grip surprisingly strong despite her injuries. She had the hands of someone who'd worked her entire life. Scarred and calloused, capable. "There's something else," Sherry said, her voice dropping. "Sophie needs to go back to school. She's missed almost a week already. Her teachers are asking questions." Van had anticipated this problem. A child disappearing for a week raised flags. Questions led to investigations. And investigations led to places Van didn't want anyone looking. "What have you told them?" Van asked. "Nothing yet. I called the school 3 days ago and said Sophie had the flu, that she'd be back soon. But I can't keep using that excuse. Can she return to her old school? Is it safe?" Sherry bit her lip. "I don't know. Billy agreed to leave us alone, but his people know where we live. They know Sophie's school, her routine, everything. I can't shake the feeling that we're not really safe, just temporarily protected." She wasn't wrong. Billy had backed down from direct confrontation, but that didn't mean he'd forgotten or forgiven. Men like Billy held grudges, waited for opportunities, struck when defenses dropped. "You need to relocate," Van said. "New apartment, new school, new neighborhood. Somewhere Billy's network doesn't reach. With what money? My savings account has $300. I was behind on rent before this happened. Everything I own is in that apartment, and I'm guessing Billy's men have been through it by now." Van pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Nicholas. "Arrange relocation for Sherry and Sophie. 2-bedroom apartment, good neighborhood, near quality schools. Budget is whatever it takes." The response came immediately. "Already working on it. Found a place in Riverside District. Safe, clean, far from Billy's territory." Van looked back at Sherry. "It's handled. You keep saying that, but nothing is just handled. Everything costs something. Then consider it part of your employment package. Dominic's pays well. You'll have health insurance, paid time off, employee housing assistance, standard benefits." Sherry's eyes narrowed. "You're making this up as you go, aren't you? Creating a job, inventing benefits, just to make me feel like I'm not accepting charity. Does it matter if the end result is the same?" "Yes, it matters to me." Van respected that. Pride was often all people had left when everything else was stripped away. "The job is real," Van said. "Dominic's needs help. You have the skills. The housing assistance exists for all employees who need it. I'm not inventing anything." I'm just extending existing policies to include you. It was half true. The job was real, but Van was absolutely bending policies to accommodate Sherry's situation. He'd figure out the paperwork later. Sherry studied his face, searching for the lie, for the angle. When she didn't find what she was looking for, she nodded slowly. Okay. I'll take the job, the apartment, all of it. But I'm keeping track. I'm going to pay you back eventually. Even if it takes years. Fair enough. Sophie had been quiet throughout the negotiation, watching the adults trade terms like she was observing a chess match. Now she spoke up, her voice small but clear. What about my school? Can I go back to my old one? Van looked at her. Would you want to, knowing Billy's people might be watching? Sophie considered this seriously. My friends are there. My teacher is nice. I like the library. But? Van prompted. But I don't want those men to find us again. I don't want them to hurt Mama again. Sophie's hand found Sherry's. I'd rather have a new school if it means being safe. 7 years old, and already making calculations that prioritize survival over comfort. Van recognized that mindset because he'd lived it. New school then, Van said. Nicholas will handle enrollment. You'll start fresh somewhere safe. Will you visit? Sophie asked suddenly. The question caught Van off guard. Visit? After we move. After Mama goes back to work and I go to new school. Will you come check on us sometimes? Van had no answer. He hadn't thought past the immediate crisis, past getting them safe and stable. The idea of maintaining contact, of being part of their lives beyond this temporary protection, felt foreign and uncomfortable. Sophie, Sherry said gently. Mr. Doyle has his own life. We can't expect him to. I'll visit. Van interrupted. He didn't know why he said it. The words just came, bypassing logic and strategy. Sophie's face lit up with a smile that made Van's chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. When had he last cared whether a child smiled? When had anyone's happiness mattered to him beyond its utility? Promise? Sophie held out her pinky finger, the universal gesture of childhood oaths. Van looked at that tiny finger extended toward him, at the hope and trust radiating from this little girl who should have learned by now that trusting dangerous men led to disaster. He hooked his pinky around hers. Promise. Sherry watched this exchange with an expression Van couldn't read. Relief? Fear? Something else entirely? We should let you rest, Van said, standing. The moment felt too heavy, too close to something real and complicated. Van. Sherry's use of his first name stopped him at the door. Why are you really doing this? Not the story about your sister, though I believe that's part of it. But there's something else. Something you're not saying. Van was quiet for a long moment. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable. He'd spent 20 years building walls around anything resembling sentiment, convincing himself that power and control were enough. But Sophie's desperate grip on his hand had cracked something open, revealed a hollow space he'd been pretending didn't exist. I'm tired, Van said finally. Tired of being the monster everyone fears. Tired of making decisions that only benefit me. Tired of living in a world where little girls have to run barefoot through alleys begging strangers for mercy. He looked back at Sherry and Sophie, these two people who'd accidentally become important to him. Maybe I'm doing this because I want to prove I'm more than what I've become, Van continued. Or maybe I'm doing it because your daughter looked at me like I was capable of being better, and I wanted that to be true. Sherry nodded slowly. That's honest. I appreciate honest. Van left before the conversation could go deeper, before he revealed more than he intended. Nicholas was in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, coordinating the relocation with his typical efficiency. Apartments secured, Nicholas reported when he ended the call. 2-bedroom, 3rd floor, security building. Near Jefferson Elementary, which has good ratings and no connection to Billy's territory. Moving truck can be ready tomorrow, if you want to salvage anything from their old place. Send someone to assess what's worth keeping. If Billy's people damaged or contaminated anything, replace it. Don't make Sherry and Sophie sort through wreckage. Understood. Also, Lyle called. Says he needs to see you. Something about the buyout arrangements triggering interest from other operators. Van sighed. He'd known the Billy situation would have ripples. Other small-time operators watching to see if Van's mercy extended to them, if they could operate without consequences as long as they avoided the most egregious violence. Tell Lyle I'll meet him at the office in an hour. Nicholas hesitated. Boss, are you sure about all this? The job? The apartment? The promises to visit? You're getting attached. I'm aware. Attachment makes you vulnerable. It gives your enemies leverage. I know. And you're doing it anyway. Yes. Nicholas was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Your call, boss. Just be careful. The world you live in doesn't reward people for having hearts. Van moved to the windows, looking out at the city he'd spent 2 decades claiming through violence and intimidation. Nicholas was right. In Van's world, sentiment was weakness. Caring about people gave enemies targets. Love was a liability that got people killed. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way to live. A way that included power and protection but also made room for something more human. Van's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Interesting move with Billy. People are talking. Some admire it. Some see opportunity. Be careful what precedents you set. The message wasn't signed, but Van recognized the pattern. Someone in his network, someone who'd worked with him long enough to offer advice without fear of immediate retaliation. Van deleted the message and pocketed the phone. Precedents were already set. The question now was whether he could maintain them without destroying everything he'd built. From the bedroom, he heard Sophie's laughter at something Sherry said. The sound was light, genuine, untainted by the horror of 4 days ago. That sound was worth whatever complications followed. Van grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator. Time to meet with Lyle, to manage the ripples, to prove that mercy and power could coexist if you were strong enough to enforce both. The city waited below, full of people who needed protecting, and people who needed stopping. Van would figure out which was which, one decision at a time, starting with making sure Sherry and Sophie had the fresh start they deserved. Everything else could wait. Chapter 6. When Power Meets Principle. Lyle's office was in the financial district, occupying a floor of a building where legitimate businessmen conducted legitimate business that would never withstand close scrutiny. The decor was expensive without being ostentatious, designed to project success while avoiding the kind of attention that invited investigation. Van found Lyle behind his desk, surrounded by files and looking more stressed than usual. 3 decades of navigating criminal enterprises had taught Lyle to maintain composure under pressure, but today the cracks were showing. We have a situation, Lyle said without preamble. Several situations, actually, all stemming from your very public rescue of Sherry Brennan. Van sat in the leather chair across from the desk. I'm listening. Lyle pulled out a file and slid it across. This is Christopher Clifford, runs a gambling operation on the west side. Small time, mostly underground card games and sports betting. He heard about your deal with Billy and decided to test the waters. Test them how? He roughed up one of his debtors last night. Not badly, just enough to send a message. Then he waited to see if you'd intervene like you did with Sherry. Van opened the file, scanning the details. The victim was a 50-year-old man named Frank Morrison who'd lost money betting on basketball games. Nothing sympathetic about it. No child involved. No dramatic rescue scenario. Did I intervene? Van asked. No. Because Morrison isn't some innocent waitress with a cute kid. He's a gambling addict who knew the risks when he placed his bets. But here's the problem now. Christopher is telling people that your protection only extends to people you personally like, that there's no actual rule, just your mood. Van closed the file. He's right. Lyle's face registered surprise. You're admitting it? I'm not running a charity. I helped Sherry because her situation warranted it. Morrison made bad choices and is facing predictable consequences. Those are different scenarios. But from the outside, it looks arbitrary. It looks like you'll save people based on whim, rather than principle. That makes you unpredictable, which makes you dangerous in ways people can't calculate. Good. Unpredictable keeps people cautious. Lyle leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples like a headache was forming behind his eyes. Van, I've advised you for 15 years. I've helped you build something substantial from nothing, but I can't advise you if I don't understand what you're doing. I'm doing what I've always done. making decisions based on what feels right at the time. That's not true. You've always been strategic, calculating every move 3 steps ahead. This thing with Sherry, it's different. It's emotional. Van didn't deny it. There was no point. What do you want from me? Van asked. You want me to establish formal rules about who gets protection and who doesn't? Create a whole bureaucracy around mercy? I want you to understand the position you've put us in. We're getting inquiries from people who owe money to various operators. They're asking if they can come to you for protection. Some of them have legitimate hardships. Some are just looking for an easy out from their debts. Tell them no. I have been. But word spreads. People talk. By next week, every small-time operator in the city is going to be wondering if their business model still works or if Van Doyle has decided to become some kind of vigilante protector of the downtrodden. Van stood and moved to the window. From up here, the city looked orderly, organized, each building and street fitting into a logical pattern. But Van knew the truth. Down there in the streets, chaos ruled. People made desperate choices, hurt each other over money and pride and fear. The only thing preventing complete anarchy was the threat of consequences from people powerful enough to enforce them. For 20 years, Van had been one of those enforcers. People feared him, which made them careful. Fear created a kind of peace, unstable and temporary, but functional. Now he'd introduced a new variable, mercy, and mercy was harder to predict than violence. What do you suggest? Van asked, turning back to Lyle. I suggest you make this about more than just Sherry. If you're going to change how things work, change them systematically. Establish rules. Make it clear what you will and won't tolerate from operators in your territory. Such as, Lyle pulled out a legal pad and began writing. No violence against women or children as collection tactics. No predatory lending rates above a certain threshold. No targeting people who are genuinely trying to repay but hit temporary hardship. Operators who follow these rules can work without interference. Operators who break them face consequences. Van considered this. It was more structure than he'd intended, more commitment to principles he wasn't sure he believed in. But it was also smart. Rules created predictability. Predictability reduced chaos. What happens when someone breaks the rules? Van asked. First offense, warning and fine. Second offense, we buy out their operation at a steep discount. Third offense, they're out of business permanently. Define permanently. Lyle met his eyes. However, permanently needs to be defined to make the point. Van nodded slowly. Draft the rules. Run them by Nicholas and the others. Make sure they're enforceable. But Lyle? The rules apply to everyone except me. I reserve the right to make exceptions when situations warrant it. That defeats the purpose of having rules. No. It acknowledges that rules are guidelines, not absolutes. Sometimes situations require judgment calls that don't fit neat categories. Lyle made a note on his pad. Fine. But Van? Be careful with these judgment calls. Every exception you make weakens the structure. Too many exceptions and you're back to being unpredictable. I'll be careful. Van's phone buzzed. A text from Nicholas. Problem at the penthouse. Sherry collapsed. Patrick's on his way. Van's chest tightened. I have to go. He was out the door before Lyle could respond, moving through the building with single-minded purpose. The Mercedes was waiting downstairs, engine running. Van slid into the driver's seat and accelerated into traffic, breaking every speed limit between the financial district and the penthouse. His mind raced through possibilities. Infection setting in, internal bleeding they'd missed, complications from the broken ribs. All scenarios where Sherry got worse instead of better, where his protection failed to save her. When he reached the penthouse, Patrick was already there, kneeling beside Sherry who was lying on the living room floor. Sophie stood against the wall, her face pale with terror, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. What happened? Van demanded. She stood up too fast, Nicholas explained. Got dizzy and went down, hit her head on the coffee table. Van looked at Sherry. Her eyes were closed, a new cut above her eyebrow adding fresh blood to old bruises. Patrick was checking her pupils with a penlight, his expression concerned but not panicked. Concussion? Van asked. Possibly. Her pupils are reactive, which is good. but she's been on pain medication that can cause dizziness. Combined with standing too quickly after days of bed rest, it's not surprising she fainted. Is she going to be okay? Patrick looked up at him, and Van heard the edge of desperation in his own voice. When had he started caring this much? When had Sherry's survival become something that could make his chest constrict with fear? She'll be fine, Patrick said. But she needs to take it slower. No sudden movements. Gradual increases in activity. And probably reducing the pain medication now that the worst of the healing is past. Sherry's eyes fluttered open. She saw Patrick, then Van, then Sophie pressed against the wall. "Sophie," she whispered. "Come here, baby." Sophie ran to her mother, dropping to her knees beside Patrick. "You scared me, Mama. You fell so hard." "I know. I'm sorry. I just got up too fast. Thought I could walk to the kitchen. Guess I was wrong." Patrick helped Sherry sit up slowly, monitoring her for signs of dizziness or nausea. When she seemed stable, Nicholas and Van carefully lifted her back to the bedroom, settling her against the pillows with more care than they'd use handling explosives. "No more heroics," Patrick told Sherry firmly. "You're healing well, but you're not healed. Take it slow, accept help, and stop trying to prove you're stronger than your injuries." Sherry nodded, looking embarrassed. "I just wanted to get some water. I didn't want to bother anyone." "Bother us," Van said. "That's what we're here for." After Patrick left and Nicholas returned to the living room, Van pulled the chair close to Sherry's bed. Sophie had climbed up beside her mother, wrapped around Sherry like a small, protective blanket. "You terrified me," Van said quietly. Sherry looked surprised. "I terrified you? You're Van Doyle. I didn't think anything scared you. I thought you were dying. I thought despite everything, despite the doctor and the medication and the protection, you were going to die anyway. And that would bother you?" Van was quiet for a long moment. The honest answer was, yes, it would bother him more than almost anything had in years. But admitting that felt like handing Sherry ammunition to hurt him, felt like acknowledging a vulnerability he'd spent 2 decades building walls around. "Yes," he said finally, "it would bother me." Sherry studied his face with her one good eye. "Because you made a promise to Sophie? Because you invested resources in saving us? Because I care whether you live or die? Because somehow in the space of less than a week you and your daughter became people I don't want to lose?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to address. "That's dangerous," Sherry said softly. "For you, caring about people makes you vulnerable." "I know. And you're doing it anyway." Apparently, Sophie had been quiet, watching the exchange with her usual intense focus. Now she spoke up, her voice small but clear. "Is it bad that Mr. Doyle cares about us?" Sherry stroked her daughter's hair. "No, baby. It's not bad. It's just complicated." "Why?" "Because caring about people means you can be hurt when bad things happen to them. And people in Mr. Doyle's world, they might try to hurt us to hurt him." Sophie processed this, her young mind working through adult concepts. "Then we have to be extra careful. We have to make sure nobody can use us to hurt him." Van almost smiled at the fierce determination in Sophie's voice. This child who'd been terrified and helpless 4 days ago was now thinking about protection and strategy. "That's why you're moving to a new apartment," Van explained. "New neighborhood, new school, new routines. Making you harder to find makes everyone safer." "When do we move?" Sherry asked. "Tomorrow, if you're strong enough. The apartment is ready. Nicholas has already arranged for furniture and supplies. You'll have everything you need." "And then what? We just disappear from your life? Become normal people in a normal neighborhood?" Van hadn't thought that far ahead. The logical answer was yes, that was exactly what should happen. Get them safe, get them stable, then step back. And let them rebuild without his shadow hanging over their lives. But the thought of never seeing Sophie's serious little face again, of not knowing whether Sherry fully healed, of losing contact with the 2 people who'd accidentally become important to him, that thought created an ache he couldn't ignore. "I made Sophie a promise," Van said. "I said I'd visit. I intend to keep that promise." Sherry nodded slowly. "Okay. But Van? When you visit, come as yourself, not as the person everyone fears. Sophie needs to see that you're more than just the dangerous man who saved us." I'm not sure I am more than that. Then figure it out. Because my daughter looks at you like you're some kind of hero, and heroes are supposed to be good people, not just powerful ones. Van stood, feeling uncomfortable with the weight of Sherry's expectations. He'd never claimed to be good. Power, control, effectiveness, these were the measures he understood. Goodness was abstract, subjective, and ultimately irrelevant in the world where he operated. But maybe Sherry was right. Maybe if Sophie was going to look at him with hope and trust, he needed to be more than just the monster who occasionally did the right thing. Get some rest, Van told them. Tomorrow's a big day. He left before Sherry could push the conversation deeper, before she could ask questions he didn't have answers for. In the living room, Nicholas was on the phone coordinating the move. He looked up when Van entered. Everything okay in there? Define okay. Nicholas ended his call. Boss, I know I said attachment was dangerous, but for what it's worth, I think what you're doing is good. Not strategic, not calculated, just good. Good doesn't pay the bills. No, but it might make paying the bills feel like it matters. Van moved to the windows, watching the city prepare for night. Lights flickered on in buildings across the harbor, people settling into evening routines, having dinners, watching television, living lives that didn't involve territory disputes and violence. Normal lives, the kind Sherry and Sophie deserved. Van's phone buzzed. A text from Lyle. Rules drafted. Sending them over for review. Also, Christopher is spreading rumors that you're going soft. Might need to address that. Van deleted the message. Christopher and his rumors could wait. Right now, Van had more important things to focus on. Like making sure Sophie and Sherry made it to tomorrow safely. Like figuring out how to be the person Sophie thought he was. Like learning whether power and goodness could coexist, or if choosing one meant sacrificing the other. The answers wouldn't come tonight. But tomorrow, when Sherry and Sophie moved into their new life, Van would take the first step toward finding out. Chapter 7. Fresh start. Old shadows. The moving truck arrived at 7 in the morning, earlier than Van had planned but later than Nicholas had wanted. Security concerns dictated timing fewer witnesses, less chance of Billy's people tracking the move. Sherry sat in the penthouse living room, watching the sunrise paint the harbor in shades of gold and pink. She could walk now without support, though her movements were still careful, calculated to avoid jarring her healing ribs. The bruises had faded to yellow-green shadows that makeup could mostly hide. Sophie sat beside her mother, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that Nicholas had retrieved from their old apartment, along with clothes and a few personal items. The rabbit was missing one ear, and had stitches across its stomach, where Sophie had attempted surgery with a needle and thread years ago. Ready? Van asked from the doorway. Sherry turned, and Van saw the mixture of emotions crossing her face. Relief at finally leaving this gilded cage. Anxiety about what came next. Gratitude mixed with residual fear that this was all temporary, that safety was an illusion that could shatter at any moment. Ready, Sherry confirmed. The drive to the new apartment took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Van drove while Nicholas followed in a second vehicle, maintaining surveillance for any sign of tracking or ambush. The route had been planned to avoid areas where Billy's people operated, taking them through neighborhoods where Van's influence was stronger. The Riverside district was exactly what Nicholas had promised: safe, clean, family-oriented. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained buildings, parks where children played without looking over their shoulders. The kind of place that seemed like fiction to people who'd spent their lives in rougher neighborhoods. The apartment building was modest but secure, with a locked entrance, security cameras, and a superintendent who'd been thoroughly vetted and generously compensated to report anything unusual. Third floor, Nicholas announced, holding the door open. Corner unit, windows facing the park. Extra locks installed, security system active. They took the elevator up, Sophie pressed against Sherry's side, her eyes wide as she absorbed her new surroundings. The hallway was quiet, carpeted, smelling faintly of cleaning products and fresh paint. Nicholas unlocked apartment 3C and stepped inside first, performing a final security sweep even though he'd already done 3 in the past 24 hours. Paranoia kept people alive in Van's world. Clear, Nicholas called. Van held the door for Sherry and Sophie, watching their reactions as they entered their new home. The apartment was bright with morning sunlight streaming through large windows. The living room was furnished simply but comfortably: a couch, chairs, coffee table, television mounted on the wall. The kitchen was small but functional, already stocked with groceries Nicholas had arranged. 2 bedrooms, one significantly larger than the other, both with actual beds and dressers. Sophie ran to explore, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Sherry stood in the center of the living room, turning slowly to take it all in. "This is too much," she whispered. "It's a 2-bedroom apartment," Van replied, "hardly excessive. For us it is. We've been living in a studio with water damage and a bathroom that barely worked. This is—" her voice cracked. "This is more than I could have given her on my own." Van understood the weight behind those words. Every parent wanted to provide for their children, and failing to do so carried a special kind of shame. Accepting help meant admitting defeat, acknowledging that your best wasn't enough. "You'll pay me back through work," Van said, making it about transaction rather than charity. "Consider this an advance on your salary." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The apartment was paid for through one of Van's holding companies, the rent a rounding error in his monthly expenses, but the lie allowed Sherry to maintain dignity, to frame this as employment benefits rather than rescue. "When do I start at Dominic's?" Sherry asked. "Monday. Light duty to start 4-hour shifts, mostly administrative work until you're fully healed. Patrick will check on you twice a week for the next month." Sophie emerged from the bedrooms, her face glowing with excitement. "Mama, the big bedroom has its own bathroom, and my room has a window that looks at the park. I can see the playground from here." Sherry smiled, the first genuine smile Van had seen from her. "That sounds perfect, baby. Can we go to the park later, please?" Sherry glanced at Van, uncertainty clouding her expression. Was it safe? Were there restrictions? Did leaving the apartment violate some unspoken rule about protection? "You can go to the park anytime you want," Van said. "You're not prisoners. This is your home now. Live in it." "What about Billy's people?" Sherry asked quietly, her voice low enough that Sophie wouldn't hear from the other room. "They don't know about this place. We've made sure of it. But as a precaution, I'll have someone nearby for the first few weeks. Not intrusive, just watchful." "One of your men?" "Yes. He'll maintain distance, but if there's trouble, he'll intervene." Sherry absorbed this, the reality of her new life settling in. Safety came with surveillance, freedom came with invisible constraints. It was better than the alternative, but it wasn't the normal life she'd hoped to give Sophie. "Thank you," Sherry said finally. "For all of it. The apartment, the job, the protection. I know I keep saying I'll pay you back, but I need you to know I mean it. I won't forget what you've done. Just take care of yourself and Sophie. That's payment enough." A knock at the door made everyone tense. Nicholas drew his weapon smoothly, positioning himself between the door and Van. Through the peephole, he relaxed fractionally. "Moving crew," Nicholas announced, opening the door to reveal 3 men carrying boxes. Over the next hour, furniture from Sherry's old apartment arrived. The pieces that had survived Billy's men ransacking the place. A small dining table with mismatched chairs. A bookshelf filled with Sophie's picture books and Sherry's paperback novels. Kitchen items, clothes, the accumulated debris of 2 lives packed into cardboard boxes. Sophie directed the placement of her belongings with serious focus, making sure her stuffed animals were arranged on her bed in specific order, her books organized by some system only she understood. Sherry moved more slowly, wincing occasionally when she forgot to be careful, unpacking plates and hanging clothes with methodical efficiency. Van watched them settle in, these 2 people who'd crashed into his life and somehow become fixtures he couldn't imagine removing. Sophie, with her serious eyes and fierce protectiveness of her mother. Sherry, with her pride and determination to maintain independence even while accepting help. "Boss," Nicholas said quietly. "We should go. Let them get settled without us hovering." Nicholas was right. Van's presence added pressure, made this feel less like home and more like an extension of the penthouse's protective custody. "I'm leaving," Van announced. "Nicholas will finish coordinating with the security team. If you need anything, call." The number is programmed into the phone on the kitchen counter. Sherry emerged from the bedroom. "You're going? You don't need me here for unpacking. Will you come back? Or was this the end of your involvement?" Van looked at Sophie, who'd stopped organizing her bookshelf to listen. The girl's face showed hope mixed with resignation, like she'd learned not to expect promises to be kept but couldn't help hoping anyway. "I made Sophie a promise," Van said. "I keep my promises." "When?" Sophie asked, moving closer. "Soon. Give yourselves a few days to settle in, get used to the new neighborhood, then I'll visit. Do you promise?" Van crouched down so he was eye level with Sophie. "I promise. But Sophie, when I visit, it won't be like this. No security team, no business. Just checking in to make sure you're okay. Like a friend?" The word felt foreign. Van didn't have friends, he had associates, employees, people whose loyalty he'd purchased through fear or compensation. Friendship implied equality, mutual vulnerability, trust that went beyond calculation. But looking at Sophie's hopeful face, Van couldn't bring himself to correct her terminology. "Like a friend," Van agreed. Sophie threw her arms around his neck, hugging him with the unself-conscious affection of a child who hadn't yet learned to guard her emotions. Van stiffened, unsure how to respond, then awkwardly patted her back. When Sophie released him, Van stood to find Sherry watching, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Take care of each other," Van said, then left before the moment could become more complicated. In the hallway, Nicholas was coordinating with the security team through his phone. He ended the call as Van approached. "Perimeter is set," Nicholas reported. 2 men rotating 8-hour shifts. "They'll maintain visual on the building but won't interfere unless there's a threat." "Good. Make sure Sherry and Sophie don't notice them. I want this to feel like a normal life, not witness protection." "Understood, boss. That was good what you did in there. With Sophie, I mean. She needed to hear that she matters to you." Van didn't respond, just moved toward the elevator. Emotions were complicated, messy things that didn't fit neatly into the framework he'd built his life around. Caring about Sophie and Sherry created vulnerabilities he didn't know how to protect. But walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. They drove back through the city in silence, Van's mind already shifting to other problems. Lyle's drafted rules needed review. Christopher's rumors needed addressing. A dozen other small fires requiring attention. But underneath all of it, a part of Van's consciousness remained in that apartment, watching Sophie organize her books and Sherry hang clothes in a closet that didn't smell like mildew. Building a life that included safety and possibility. Van's phone rang. "Lyle. Tell me you've reviewed the rules," Lyle said without preamble. "Not yet." "Van, Christopher is getting louder. He beat another debtor last night, this time a woman. He's daring you to respond, trying to prove that your protection of Sherry was a one-time thing." Van's jaw tightened. Details. Woman named Edna Graham. 46 years old, single mother of 2. Borrowed money from Christopher for her son's medical treatment. Got behind on payments. Christopher sent his guys to deliver a message. How bad? Not as bad as Sherry was, but bad enough. Broken arm. Facial lacerations. Bruised ribs. She's in the hospital claiming she fell downstairs. Van's hands clenched around the steering wheel. Another mother. Another desperate situation exploited by predators who thought violence was an acceptable business practice. Where is she now? Street Mary's Hospital, room 412. But Van, before you go charging in like you did with Sherry, think about what you're doing. If you intervene for every person who gets roughed up by loan sharks, you'll be fighting a dozen different operators by the end of the month. Then maybe it's time those operators learn new business practices. You can't save everyone. No, but I can make examples of people who think I won't try. Van ended the call and changed direction, heading for Street Mary's instead of his office. Nicholas adjusted course without being told, already anticipating where this was going. "Christopher is testing you," Nicholas observed. "He's seeing if the Sherry situation was real policy or just sentiment. Then let's make sure he gets a clear answer." They reached the hospital 20 minutes later. Van moved through the lobby with purpose, Nicholas trailing behind, both of them drawing stares from visitors and staff who recognized danger when they saw it. Room 412 was in the surgical wing. Through the partially open door, Van could see a woman lying in bed, her left arm in a cast, her face showing the same pattern of bruises Sherry had worn. 2 teenagers sat beside the bed, a boy maybe 15 and a girl slightly younger. Van knocked softly. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him, showing the same progression of emotions he'd seen in Sherry: confusion, recognition, fear. "Mrs. Graham," Van said quietly. "My name is Van Doyle. I'd like to talk to you about Christopher Clifford and what happened last night." Edna's good hand moved protectively toward her children. "I don't know what you're talking about. I fell." "No, you didn't. Christopher's men did this because you're behind on a loan, just like they did to another woman a week ago." "Please," Edna whispered. "Please just leave us alone. We can't afford any more trouble." Van stepped into the room, making his movements slow and non-threatening. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to offer help." "Why would you help us? We're nobody to you." It was the same question Sherry had asked. Van was starting to understand that people who'd spent their lives powerless couldn't comprehend that power might be used to protect rather than exploit. "You're someone Christopher hurt to make a point," Van said. "That makes you my business now." The teenage boy stood, positioning himself between Van and his mother. "You're that guy. The one everyone talks about. You're scarier than Christopher." "Probably," Van agreed. "But I'm not here to hurt your mother. I'm here to make sure Christopher doesn't either." "And what does that cost us?" the boy challenged. "Mom doesn't have money. We don't have anything to give you." Van looked at this teenager trying to protect his family with nothing but courage, and saw himself at that age, desperate, angry, willing to fight battles he couldn't win just to prove he wouldn't surrender. "It costs nothing," Van said. "I'm going to forgive your mother's debt to Christopher. I'm going to make sure he never bothers your family again. And then I'm going to leave you alone to heal." "Why?" Edna's voice was barely audible. "Why would you do that?" Van looked at her children, at their protective stances and suspicious eyes, and remembered Sophie running through fog to save her mother. "Because someone should," Van said simply. "Because people like Christopher think they can hurt people like you without consequences. I'm here to prove them wrong." He pulled out his phone and texted Lyle, "Buy out Edna Graham's debt from Christopher, today, whatever it costs." The response came immediately. "This is going to start something." Van typed back, "Good, let it start." He looked at Edna and her children. "Your debt to Christopher is being handled. He won't come near you again. If he tries, call this number." Van wrote on the notepad beside the bed, leaving his direct line. "I don't understand," Edna whispered. "You don't have to. Just heal. Take care of your kids, that's all." Van left before she could ask more questions, before the gratitude and confusion could become expectations he wasn't ready to meet. In the hallway, Nicholas was shaking his head. "You just declared war on Christopher. You know that, right?" "Yes. And tomorrow there'll be another operator who heard about this and decided to test you with another victim." "Probably." "Boss, where does this end? How many people are you going to protect? How many operators are you going to fight?" Van was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Where did it end? When did mercy become an unsustainable burden? When did protecting people stop being justice and become martyrdom? "It ends when they stop testing me," Van said finally. "When every operator in this city understands that there are rules now, and breaking them has consequences. And if they don't stop, then I keep fighting until they do, or until I can't anymore." Nicholas nodded slowly. "Okay. Then we better get ready, because Christopher's not going to back down like Billy did." They left the hospital and drove toward Van's office, where Lyle waited with rules that would either establish a new order or trigger a war that would burn through the city. Van thought about Sophie in her new apartment, organizing her books and looking at the park through her window. Thought about Sherry unpacking clothes and trying to build a normal life from the wreckage of violence. They deserved safety. So did Edna and her children. So did everyone who'd been ground down by predators who mistook cruelty for business. Van couldn't save everyone, but he could save some. And he could make sure that the ones he did save got the chance Sophie and Sherry were getting a fresh start. Protected space to heal. Hope that tomorrow might be better than today. It was more than Van had ever had. More than his sister had gotten. Maybe making sure others had it would be enough. Chapter 8. Drawing Lines in Blood. Christopher Clifford received Van's message at 3 in the afternoon. Not a phone call or a text, but a visit from 2 of Van's men who walked into Christopher's card room on the west side and laid a folder on the poker table, where Christopher was running an illegal game. "Mr. Doyle wants you to understand something," one of the men said, his voice polite but carrying an edge that made the card players freeze mid-deal. Christopher opened the folder. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a receipt showing that Edna Graham's debt had been purchased and forgiven. The second was a list of rules, Lyle's carefully drafted guidelines about acceptable lending practices and prohibited collection tactics. At the bottom, in handwriting Christopher recognized as Van's, a single sentence: "Follow these, or we'll have a conversation you won't enjoy." Christopher read it twice, his face darkening with anger. Around the table, the card players watched nervously, sensing the shift in atmosphere from casual gambling to something more dangerous. "Tell Van Doyle," Christopher said slowly, "that I don't take orders from him. I run my own operation. If he has a problem with how I do business, he can come tell me himself." The 2 men exchanged glances. One pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking too quietly for Christopher to hear. After a brief conversation, he hung up and looked at Christopher. "Mr. Doyle says he'll be here in 20 minutes. He suggests you use that time to decide if you want this to be a conversation or a demonstration." They left before Christopher could respond. The card game broke up immediately, players gathering their chips and hurrying out like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Within 5 minutes, the card room was empty, except for Christopher and his 3 personal security men. "This is about the waitress," one of Christopher's men said. "Van's got soft over some woman and her kid. Everyone's talking about it." "Van Doyle doesn't get soft," Christopher replied, pacing the room. "This is strategy. He's trying to consolidate territory by making himself look like some kind of protector. It's a power play." "Then what do we do?" Christopher considered his options. He could run, disappear before Van arrived, avoid the confrontation entirely, but running would make him look weak. Would invite other operators to test him the way he'd tested Van. He could fight, turn this meeting into an ambush. But Van didn't walk into situations unprepared. The man had survived 2 decades in a business where most people lasted 5 years. Or he could talk, see what Van really wanted, find an angle that let both of them save face. "We talk," Christopher decided. "But keep your weapons ready. If Van makes a move, we respond." The 20 minutes passed like hours. Christopher chain-smoked, burning through half a pack of cigarettes while his men checked weapons and positioned themselves strategically around the room. When Van arrived, he came alone. That single fact told Christopher everything he needed to know about how confident Van was in his position. Walking into a potential ambush without backup wasn't bravery. It was certainty that the ambush wouldn't happen. Van entered the card room like he owned it, his expensive suit unmarked, his expression neutral. He looked around at Christopher's 3 armed men, then at Christopher. "Interesting decorating choices," Van observed. "Early intimidation, with hints of desperation. You've got nerve coming here alone." "I'm not alone. I have 3 men on the roof with rifles, 2 in the building across the street, another 5 covering the exits. If I don't walk out of here in 15 minutes, they have instructions to turn this building into rubble. So technically, I'm very well accompanied." Christopher couldn't tell if Van was bluffing. The man's face gave nothing away. "What do you want?" Christopher asked. Van pulled out a chair and sat, making himself comfortable at the poker table. "I want you to read those rules I sent. Really read them, not just skim them with the intention of ignoring them. I don't answer to you. You operate in my city. That means you answer to me whether you like it or not." "Your city?" "Last I checked, this was a free territory. Multiple operators, no single authority." "That was true until last week," Van agreed. "Then I decided the free-for-all approach wasn't working. Too much violence, too much exploitation of people who can't fight back. It's bad for business, and worse for my conscience." Christopher laughed, the sound harsh. "Your conscience? Van Doyle has a conscience now? What happened? You get religion." "I got perspective. Turns out watching 7-year-old girls beg for their mothers' lives tends to clarify your priorities. The waitress and her kid. Everyone's talking about it. Some say you're going soft. Others say it's a long con, that you're using them to justify a territory grab. What do you say?" Christopher studied Van's face, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the trap. "I say I don't understand you anymore. The Van Doyle I knew didn't care about waitresses or their kids. He cared about power and profit. This new version? I don't know what to make of it. Then let me make it simple, Van said. The rules I sent you aren't suggestions, they're requirements. You can lend money, you can charge interest, you can even use intimidation for collection, but you can't brutalize people, especially not women and children. You can't charge rates that make repayment impossible. You can't target people who are genuinely trying to pay but hit temporary hardship. Those rules make it impossible to run a profitable lending operation. No, they make it impossible to run a predatory lending operation. There's a difference. Legitimate lending can be profitable. Exploiting desperate people isn't lending. It's extortion. Christopher leaned back in his chair. And if I refuse? If I tell you to take your rules and your conscience and get out of my card room? Van's expression didn't change. Then I make an example of you. I shut down your operation so completely that 10 years from now, people will still tell stories about what happened to Christopher Clifford when he thought he could ignore Van Doyle's rules. The threat hung in the air, heavy and unambiguous. One of Christopher's men shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his weapon. Van's eyes tracked the movement, but he didn't react otherwise. That would start a war, Christopher said. Other operators would see it as overreach. They'd band together against you. Let them. I'd rather fight everyone at once than watch this city tear itself apart one brutalized family at a time. Christopher realized with sudden clarity that Van wasn't bluffing, wasn't posturing, wasn't playing some elaborate strategic game. The man had genuinely changed, had decided that power without principles was hollow. It was simultaneously admirable and terrifying. How much did you pay for Edna Graham's debt? Christopher asked. 5,000. More than it was worth, considering she'll never be able to pay you back anyway. She borrowed 3,000 6 months ago. With interest and fees, she owed me 4. You overpaid. Consider the extra 1,000 a consulting fee. Payment for this educational conversation we're having. Christopher made a decision. Not because he agreed with Van's rules, not because he'd suddenly developed a conscience, but because fighting Van Doyle was a losing proposition even if you won. Fine. I'll follow your rules. No more breaking bones, no more targeting families, reasonable interest rates. But Van? This better apply to everyone. If I'm following rules, every other operator better be following them too. They will be. I'm having this same conversation with 6 other people today. By tomorrow, every operator in the city will know the new terms. And if someone breaks the rules, first offense, I buy out their operation. Second offense, they're out of business. Third offense is theoretical because nobody gets a third chance. Christopher nodded slowly. The system was harsh but logical. Van wasn't eliminating the lending business, just regulating it to prevent the worst excesses. What about the Brennan woman? Sherry? Her debt to Billy was forgiven completely. Why does she get special treatment but Edna Graham's debt was bought out? Sherry got special treatment because her daughter asked for it directly. She also had a kid to feed and was being beaten to death in an alley. Edna's situation was similar but not identical, and I'm trying to establish rules, not exceptions. So there are still exceptions. If someone pleads their case well enough, if their situation is sympathetic enough, you'll still intervene outside the rules. Van stood. Yes. Because rules are guidelines for normal situations. Some situations aren't normal. Those require judgment. That makes you judge and jury over everyone's business. Yes, that's what power means. The difference now is I'm trying to use it for something besides accumulating more power. Van moved toward the door, then paused. Christopher, I'm not your enemy unless you make me one. Follow the rules, run a legitimate operation, and we'll never have a problem. But hurt someone the way you hurt Edna, the way your people hurt Sherry, and you'll discover that my new conscience doesn't extend to people who prey on the defenseless. Understood. After Van left, Christopher sat alone in the empty card room, smoking another cigarette and contemplating his new reality. Van Doyle had just rewritten the rules of the entire underground lending business in the space of 15 minutes. The smart play was to comply, adjust his business model, accept the new constraints. The prideful play was to resist, to test Van's resolve, to see if the other operators would rally together. Christopher had survived in this business by being smart, not prideful. He pulled out his phone, and called his 3 most reliable collectors. New rules as of today, he told them. No more physical intimidation. No targeting families with kids. Interest rates drop to 20% maximum. Anyone has a problem with that, they bring it to me, not the client. The collectors protested, arguing that gentle collection practices wouldn't work. Christopher listened, then cut them off. Van Doyle just visited me personally to explain his new city policies. You want to argue with him? Be my guest. But I'm following the rules because I like being alive and in business. The protests stopped. Everyone knew Van's reputation. Christopher ended the calls and opened the folder Van's men had delivered. The rules were clearly written, specific enough to follow but general enough to allow reasonable interpretation. At the bottom, a phone number with a note. Questions about rule interpretation can be directed here. It was almost funny. Van Doyle, the man who'd built an empire on fear and violence, was now running a customer service line for loan sharks who needed help understanding ethical lending practices. But Christopher wasn't laughing, because underneath the absurdity was a clear message. Van had decided how things would work in his city, and anyone who disagreed would learn painful lessons about consequences. Christopher would follow the rules. He'd adjust his business model. He'd find ways to remain profitable within the new constraints. And he'd watch carefully to see if Van's crusade for conscience would last, or if it would crumble under the weight of practicality like every other attempt to bring order to chaos. Meanwhile, across the city, similar conversations were happening in smoky backrooms and private offices. Van spent the afternoon delivering his message personally to every significant operator, making sure each understood that the rules were non-negotiable, and the consequences for violation were severe. Some accepted immediately, recognizing that compliance was cheaper than resistance. Others pushed back, testing Van's resolve, trying to find wiggle room in the rules. Van remained consistent. The rules were clear: follow them or face consequences. By evening, word had spread through the entire underground network. Van Doyle had changed. The man who'd ruled through fear was now ruling through fear tempered with principles. People didn't know what to make of it. Van returned to his office as the sun set, exhausted from a day of confrontations and negotiations. Lyle was waiting with a bottle of expensive whiskey and 2 glasses. How did it go? Lyle asked. Pouring drinks. Better than expected. Most people will comply because fighting me is stupid. A few will test the rules, but that's inevitable. Christopher will follow the rules. He's smart enough to recognize when he's outmatched. Lyle handed Van a glass. You realize what you've done today, right? You fundamentally restructured the entire underground lending economy. That kind of change creates instability, and instability creates opportunities for violence. I know. And you're committed to this? Even if it costs you? Van thought about Sophie organizing her books, about Sherry trying to build a normal life, about Edna Graham lying in a hospital bed with a broken arm because she'd borrowed money to save her son. Yes, Van said, I'm committed. Then I'll make sure everyone knows the rules are permanent, not just a temporary fit of conscience. They drank in silence, watching the city lights flicker on, as darkness claimed the harbor. Somewhere out there, Sophie was having dinner in her new apartment. Edna was recovering in her hospital bed. Dozens of other desperate people were making choices about debts and risks and survival. Van had changed the landscape they operated in. Whether that change would hold or collapse under its own idealistic weight remained to be seen. But for now, at least, the predators had rules they couldn't ignore, and the prey had someone who'd fight for them. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had yesterday. Van finished his whiskey and set the glass down. I'm going home. Tomorrow we start enforcement. Anyone who broke the rules today gets 1 warning. After that, consequences. And if they don't believe you'll follow through? Van's expression hardened. Then we'll provide a demonstration that's impossible to misunderstand. He left Lyle in the office and drove through the city toward his penthouse. The one he'd lived in for 15 years, the one that had never felt like home because he'd designed it as a fortress, not a residence. Tomorrow he'd check on Sophie and Sherry. Make sure they were settling in, that the new neighborhood felt safe, that Sophie was ready to start her new school on Monday. Tonight, he'd sit alone in his fortress and wonder if conscience and power could really coexist, or if he'd just committed to a battle he couldn't win. The city didn't answer. It just sprawled below his windows, indifferent to the small wars fought in its shadows, uncaring about whether one dangerous man decided to use his power differently. But Van cared. And maybe that would be enough. Chapter 9. Tests and Consequences. Van kept his promise to Sophie sooner than he'd planned. Sunday afternoon, 3 days after moving Sherry and Sophie into their new apartment, he showed up at their door wearing jeans and a plain black shirt, instead of his usual expensive suit. Sophie answered the door, her face lighting up with genuine joy. "Mr. Doyle, you came. I promised I would. Mama said adults sometimes promise things they don't mean. But you meant it." Van felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest at Sophie's relief that he'd kept his word. How many promises had been broken in this child's short life? "I always mean what I say," Van told her. Sophie grabbed his hand and pulled him inside. The apartment had transformed in 3 days. Curtains hung in the windows. Pictures Sophie had drawn were taped to the refrigerator. Books lined the shelves in organized chaos. It looked lived in, warm, nothing like the sterile perfection of Van's penthouse. Sherry emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She'd pulled her hair back in a ponytail, and the bruises on her face had faded enough that makeup covered most of them. She looked healthier, stronger, more like someone rebuilding than someone broken. "You're early," Sherry said. "I thought you'd wait at least a week before checking on us. I was in the neighborhood." It was a lie. Van had driven 20 minutes out of his way specifically to visit, but admitting that felt too much like acknowledging how often he'd thought about them over the past 3 days. "Well, since you're here, stay for dinner. I'm making spaghetti. Nothing fancy, but there's plenty." Van started to decline. He had work to do, calls to make, operators to monitor, but Sophie's hopeful expression stopped him. "Dinner sounds good," Van said. Sophie cheered and ran to the kitchen to help her mother. Van stood awkwardly in the living room, unsure where to sit or what to do with his hands. He'd negotiated with dangerous criminals, orchestrated complex operations, controlled territories through strategic violence. But being a dinner guest in a modest apartment with a woman and her daughter felt completely foreign. "You can sit down," Sherry called from the kitchen, amusement in her voice. "The couch won't bite." Van sat on the edge of the couch, his posture rigid. Through the kitchen doorway, he watched Sophie climb onto a step stool to help Sherry stir sauce. They worked together with easy familiarity, talking about Sophie's upcoming first day at her new school, what she should wear, whether her teacher would be nice. Normal conversations, normal concerns. The kind of mundane domesticity Van had never experienced in his own childhood and had never thought to want in adulthood. "How's the neighborhood?" Van asked when Sherry emerged to set the table. "Good, quiet. Sophie's already made friends with a girl from the building. They played at the park yesterday for 2 hours. Any problems? Anything unusual?" Sherry paused, a plate in her hand. "You mean, has anyone suspicious been watching us? Have Billy's people found us?" "No, Van. Everything's been completely normal, which is strange because I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've spent 3 days waiting for something bad to happen. For someone to knock on the door with demands or threats. For this to turn out to be too good to be true." She set the plate down carefully. "But nothing bad has happened. We're just living like normal people, and I don't know how to process that." Van understood. When you'd lived with constant crisis, peace felt suspicious, safety felt temporary. The absence of problems felt like the quiet before a storm. "Nothing bad is going to happen," Van said. "I'm making sure of it." "For how long? A month? A year? Forever?" "For as long as necessary." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." Sophie called them to dinner. The 3 of them sat around the small table, plates of spaghetti and garlic bread steaming in front of them. Sophie chattered about her new school, about the park, about the library she'd discovered 2 blocks away. Van ate and listened, contributing little to the conversation but absorbing everything. The way Sophie's hands moved when she got excited, the way Sherry smiled at her daughter with fierce pride and love, the way they both seemed to relax in increments, the tension of survival slowly unwinding. "Mr. Doyle," Sophie said suddenly, "do you have a family?" The question landed like a punch. Sherry shot her daughter a look, but Sophie's face showed only innocent curiosity. "No," Van said. "Not anymore." What happened to them? Sophie, Sherry warned. It's okay, Van said. My sister died when I was young. My mother passed away 10 years ago. My father died before that, though I didn't attend his funeral. Why not? Because he wasn't a good man. And I didn't want to pretend his death made me sad when it only made me relieved. Sophie processed this with the seriousness she brought to everything. That's sad. Everyone should have family. I have people who work for me. That's close enough. That's not the same, Sophie said with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who'd figured out a fundamental truth. Family means people love you even when you mess up. Workers are just people you pay. Sophie, that's enough, Sherry said firmly. Eat your dinner. But Van found himself thinking about Sophie's words long after the subject changed. She was right. He had loyalty purchased through money or fear, but not the unconditional connection she was describing. He'd built an empire but remained fundamentally alone in the center of it. After dinner, Sophie insisted on showing Van her room. She'd arranged her stuffed animals on the bed in specific order, organized her books by color instead of title, and hung drawings on the walls with tape. This is Mr. Rabbit, Sophie said, holding up the worn stuffed animal Van had seen her clutching on moving day. He's been with me since I was born. Mama says he's seen everything I've seen. Van looked at the tattered rabbit with its missing ear and stitched stomach. A witness to 7 years of Sophie's life, to whatever hardships and joys had shaped her. He looks well-traveled, Van said. He's survived a lot, Sophie replied seriously. Like me and Mama. From the living room, Sherry called that it was bedtime. Sophie hugged Mr. Rabbit, then surprised Van by hugging him too. Thank you for coming, she said against his shirt. It's nice having someone visit who doesn't want anything from us. Van stood frozen, unsure how to respond. He did want something from them, he just wasn't sure what. Their safety? Their happiness? Proof that he was capable of protecting something instead of just destroying things? Good night, Sophie, he managed. When Van returned to the living room, Sherry was standing by the window, looking out at the park below. The evening light painted her profile in gold and shadow. She's gotten attached to you, Sherry said without turning. I'm not sure that's wise. I'm not going anywhere. You say that now. But eventually this will become inconvenient. You'll get busy with your business, with your real life. The novelty of playing protector will wear off. Is that what you think I'm doing? Playing? Sherry finally looked at him. I don't know what you're doing. I don't understand you, Van Doyle. 1 minute you're the man everyone in this city fears. The next you're sitting at my dinner table eating spaghetti and listening to my daughter talk about her stuffed rabbit. Maybe I'm both. Nobody's both. You're either the monster or the man. You can't be both and survive. Van moved to stand beside her at the window. My whole life, people have told me what I can and can't be, what's possible and what isn't. I built what I have by ignoring those limitations. Building an empire is different from building relationships. Power is simple, you take it or you don't. But caring about people? That's complicated. That creates vulnerabilities you can't control. I know. And you're doing it anyway? Yes. Sherry was quiet for a long moment. Why? Really, why? Not the story about your sister, though I believe that's part of it. But there's more. You could have saved us and walked away. You could have set us up in this apartment and never visited. But you're here, eating dinner, promising to come back. Why? Van struggled to articulate something he barely understood himself. Because when Sophie grabbed my hand, something changed. I spent 20 years being exactly what everyone expected, powerful, ruthless, isolated. And then a terrified child looked at me like I could be better, and I wanted that to be true. So we're your redemption project? No. You're people I care about who deserve better than what you were getting. And when caring about us costs you, when your enemies figure out that Sophie and I matter to you, what happens then? Then I deal with it. That's not a plan. That's hope disguised as confidence. Van turned to face her directly. Sherry, I've spent my entire adult life making calculated decisions based on risk and reward. This isn't calculated. This isn't strategic. This is me deciding that some things matter more than safety or strategy. Like what? Like making sure Sophie has the childhood I never got. Like proving that power can be used to protect instead of exploit. Like figuring out if I can be more than just the monster everyone expects. Sherry's expression softened slightly. That's either the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me, or the most elaborate manipulation I've encountered. It's honest. Then God help us all, because honest feelings make terrible foundations for the kind of life you live. Van's phone buzzed. A text from Nicholas. Problem. Fernando Haas broke the rules. Beat a debtor badly. Need you to handle this. Van read the message twice, his jaw tightening. Fernando ran a gambling operation in the South District. One of the 6 operators Van had personally warned 3 days ago. This was the test Van had been expecting, the inevitable challenge to see if his rules had teeth. I have to go, Van said. Sherry saw his expression change, saw the shift from dinner guest to something harder and more dangerous. What happened? Someone broke the rules. I need to address it. Someone hurt someone. Yes. Are you going to hurt them back? Van didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. This is what I'm talking about, Sherry said quietly. This is who you are. You can eat spaghetti and listen to Sophie talk about stuffed animals, but you're still the man who solves problems with violence. Sometimes violence is the only language certain people understand. And Sophie? What happens when she figures out that the man she admires, the man she thinks is a hero, hurts people? I'm not her hero. I'm just someone trying to keep his promises. Van moved toward the door. Sherry followed. Van, she said as he reached for the handle. Be careful. Not for your sake, but for Sophie's. She's already lost so much. Don't make her lose you too. The concern in her voice surprised him. Sherry wasn't just worried about her daughter's attachment, she was worried about him. I'll be careful, Van promised. He left before Sherry could say anything else. Before the warmth of the apartment could make him forget why Fernando's violation needed immediate response. In the car, Nicholas was waiting with details. Fernando beat a man named Nathan Love. 63 years old, retired mechanic, who borrowed money for his granddaughter's medical treatment. Nathan missed 2 payments because his social security check was delayed. Fernando sent 3 guys to deliver a message. Nathan's in the hospital with a collapsed lung and internal bleeding. Van's hands clenched into fists. This was exactly the kind of brutality the rules were designed to prevent. Where's Fernando now? His gambling house on Porter Street. Nicholas paused. Boss, Fernando's not like Christopher. He won't back down with words. This is going to get ugly. Good. Let it be ugly. Let everyone see what happens when my rules are broken. They drove through the city in tense silence. Van's mind already calculating the confrontation ahead. Fernando needed to understand that the rules weren't suggestions. The entire operator network needed to see consequences delivered with enough force that no one else would test the boundaries. But underneath the calculation, Van thought about Sherry's words. You're still the man who solves problems with violence. She was right. He was both the man who kept promises to little girls and the man who hurt people when they broke his rules. The question was whether those 2 versions of himself could coexist, or if eventually he'd have to choose between being the protector Sophie believed in and being the monster the city needed him to be. Tonight, he'd be the monster. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to explain that to a 7-year-old who still believed in heroes. Chapter 10. Building something new. Fernando's gambling house occupied the 2nd floor of a building that had once been a factory. The windows were covered with blackout curtains, the entrance protected by 2 large men who looked like they'd been hired for their ability to intimidate rather than their intelligence. Van and Nicholas approached openly, making no attempt at stealth. The guards recognized Van immediately. Everyone in this business knew his face, and their confident postures crumbled into nervous uncertainty. Mr. Doyle, one guard said, his hand hovering near his waistband. Fernando's inside. Should I let him know you're here? He'll know soon enough. Van walked past them without waiting for permission. The guards didn't try to stop him. Smart choice. Inside, the gambling house was exactly what Van expected. Poker tables scattered across a large room, slot machines lining the walls, a bar in the corner serving overpriced drinks. The air smelled of cigarettes and desperation, the particular odor of places where people went to lose money they couldn't afford to lose. Fernando stood at the main poker table, collecting chips from a game that had just ended. He was thick-bodied and balding, wearing gold chains that were meant to project success but actually projected insecurity. "Van Doyle," Fernando said when he looked up. His tone tried for casual but landed somewhere closer to nervous. "Didn't expect to see you here. Want to sit in on a game? You beat Nathan Love," Van said, cutting through the pleasantries. "Sent 3 men to his house. Put him in the hospital with internal bleeding." Fernando's expression shifted. "Business. He owed me money, wouldn't pay. You know how it goes." "I know exactly how it goes. That's why I gave you rules 3 days ago. Rules you agreed to follow. Those rules are unrealistic. You can't run a lending operation without being able to enforce consequences. The rules don't prevent enforcement. They prevent brutality. There's a difference." Fernando set down the chips he'd been collecting and straightened to his full height. Around the room, his men moved subtly, positioning themselves between Van and the exits. "With respect, Van, you don't get to tell me how to run my operation. You might control the harbor district, but this is my territory. Everything in this city is my territory when it involves breaking the rules I established. Rules you established last week. Rules nobody voted on. Rules you implemented because you got sentimental about some waitress and her kid." Fernando's voice gained confidence as he spoke. "Half the operators in the city think you've gone soft. The other half think you're trying to eliminate competition by imposing impossible standards. And what do you think? I think you made a mistake showing mercy to Sherry Brennan. Set a precedent you can't maintain. Now you're trying to retroactively justify it by making everyone else follow rules you invented." Van moved closer to the poker table, his movements deliberate. "Fernando, I'm going to explain something to you once. Whether you understand it determines whether you leave this building on your feet or in pieces." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. The rules aren't about Sherry Brennan. They're about creating a system where people can borrow money without being terrorized, where desperation doesn't automatically lead to violence, where men like Nathan Love don't end up in hospitals because their social security checks were delayed. That's not business. That's charity. No. Charity would be forgiving all debts. Business with humanity would be recognizing that Nathan Love is 63 years old, has been paying you for 6 months, and missed 2 payments because of circumstances beyond his control. Business with humanity would be calling him, working out a payment plan, adding reasonable late fees, not sending thugs to beat him until his lung collapsed." Fernando laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're lecturing me about humanity? Van Doyle, the man who's put more people in the ground than the flu? That's rich." "I've done terrible things," Van agreed. "That's exactly why I know the difference between necessary violence and cruelty disguised as business. What you did to Nathan was cruelty. So what now? You going to beat me up to prove beating people is wrong? That's some twisted logic." Van pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's done," he said when someone answered. "Execute the transfer." He hung up and looked at Fernando. "I just bought Nathan Love's debt from you. All of it. For triple what he owes you." Fernando's eyes narrowed. "I didn't agree to sell. You don't have a choice. The money is already in your account. The debt is now mine. Nathan owes me nothing, and you have no further claim on him. You can't do that. I just did. That's your first offense. Per the rules I distributed, you've been warned and fined. The fine is that I overpaid for a debt you'll never collect. If you're smart, you'll take the money and adjust your collection practices. And if I'm not smart?" Van's expression went cold. "Second offense means I buy out your entire operation. Every debt you hold, every property you use, every piece of your business, and I'll do it at prices that leave you with nothing. You're bluffing. You can't afford to buy out every operator who steps out of line. Try me." Fernando looked around at his men, calculating odds. 8 of his guys against Van and Nicholas. The numbers favored Fernando. But numbers didn't account for reputation, for the 20 years Van had spent proving that underestimating him was fatal. "This is my livelihood," Fernando said, some of the bluster draining from his voice. "You're asking me to run a business that can't enforce its own contracts. I'm asking you to enforce contracts without hospitalizing 63-year-old men. If you can't figure out how to do that, you're in the wrong business." One of Fernando's men, A younger guy with a scar across his cheek moved closer to Van. You can't come in here making demands. Fernando runs things here. Nicholas shifted position, his hand moving to his weapon. The atmosphere in the room crystallized into something dangerous. Stand down, Fernando told his man. The younger guy hesitated, looking confused. I said stand down. The man backed off, but his posture radiated aggression barely contained. Fernando took a deep breath. Fine. Nathan Love's debt is yours. I'll adjust my collection practices. But Van? This system you're trying to build, it won't work. Eventually, you'll realize that business and humanity don't mix. That the only way to maintain order is through fear. I spent 20 years maintaining order through fear. It worked, but it didn't feel like anything worth protecting. Now I'm trying something different. And if it fails? If operators start testing you constantly because they think your rules make you weak, then I'll prove them wrong in ways they won't forget. Van turned to leave, Nicholas covering his back. They made it halfway to the door before Fernando called out. Van, one more thing. Van looked back. That little girl, Sophie Brennan, she must be pretty special for you to upend the entire city's underground economy over her. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't quite not a threat either. Just Fernando letting Van know that he'd identified the vulnerability, the pressure point that could be exploited. Van walked back to the poker table, moving with the controlled violence of a predator stalking prey. He leaned close to Fernando, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. If you or anyone else in this city goes near Sophie or her mother, I won't buy out your operation. I won't give you warnings or chances to reform. I'll erase you so completely that people will forget you ever existed. Do you understand me? Fernando's face went pale. I wasn't threatening them. I was just saying, do you understand me? Yes, crystal clear. Van straightened. Good. Then we have no further business tonight. This time when Van and Nicholas left, no one called after them. In the car, Nicholas drove while Van stared out the window at the city passing by. That went better than expected, Nicholas observed. No shooting, no one in the hospital. Fernando will follow the rules now. He's smart enough to recognize when he's outmatched. What about his comment about Sophie? That felt like testing the waters. It was. And now he knows those waters are lethal. Word will spread. Everyone will understand that Sherry and Sophie are completely off limits. Boss about that, making them such an obvious weakness, it's dangerous. You've essentially announced to every enemy you have that hurting those two people hurts you. Van knew Nicholas was right. He'd violated one of the fundamental rules of his profession: never let people know what matters to you. Caring created vulnerability. Vulnerability created opportunities for enemies. But Van was tired of living in a world where caring about people was weakness. Let them know, Van said. Let every enemy I have understand that Sophie and Sherry matter to me. And let them also understand what happens to people who threaten things I care about. Nicholas was quiet for a moment. You've changed, boss. I'm not saying it's bad. Just different. Do you approve? Doesn't matter if I approve. But for what it's worth, I think what you're doing takes more courage than anything you've done before. It's easier to be feared than loved. Easier to destroy than protect. Van thought about Sophie showing him her stuffed rabbit, about Sherry cooking dinner, about the casual domesticity he'd witnessed in their apartment. I'm not trying to be loved, Van said. I'm just trying to be someone worth Sophie's trust. They drove in silence back to Van's penthouse. It was after 11 when Van finally sat down in his living room, exhausted from a day that had started with spaghetti and ended with confronting Fernando. His phone buzzed. A text from Sherry. Sophie wanted me to tell you good night. She said you're always welcome for dinner. I second that, surprisingly. Van stared at the message for a long time. This woman who'd been beaten nearly to death, who had every reason to fear men with power, was inviting him back into her home. He typed, "Tell Sophie good night. And thank you. For dinner. And for trusting me." The response came quickly. Trust is earned, not given. You're earning it. Don't mess it up. Van smiled despite himself. Sherry didn't fear him, didn't worship him, didn't treat him like the dangerous man everyone else saw. She treated him like a complicated human being, trying to figure out how to be better. It was refreshing and terrifying in equal measure. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern developed. Van would handle his business during the day, meeting with operators, enforcing rules, managing his empire with the same efficiency he'd always employed. Then, twice a week, he'd visit Sophie and Sherry for dinner. The visits became the highlights of his week. He helped Sophie with her homework, explaining math concepts with surprising patience. He listened to stories about her new school, her new friends, the teacher who was nice but strict. He sat at dinner tables eating ordinary food and engaging in ordinary conversations about ordinary life. And slowly, imperceptibly, Van began to understand what normal people meant when they talked about home. The rules he'd implemented gradually took hold across the city. Most operators complied, recognizing that Van's system allowed them to operate profitably while avoiding the worst excesses of their profession. A few tested the boundaries and faced consequences that made others reconsider testing. Nathan Love recovered from his injuries. Van forgave his debt and gave him money to cover medical expenses. Nathan tried to refuse the charity, but Van explained it wasn't charity, it was restitution for Fernando's violation of the rules. Edna Graham, the woman Christopher had hurt, also recovered. Van offered her a job at one of his legitimate businesses, managing inventory at a warehouse. She accepted gratefully. Word spread about Van's new approach. People who'd been terrorized by loan sharks started coming forward, asking if the protection extended to them. Van couldn't help everyone, there were too many desperate people, and not enough hours in the day, but he helped some, and helping some was better than helping none. 6 weeks after Sophie had grabbed his hand in that restaurant, Van sat in his office reviewing financial reports when Lyle entered with an expression that was part concern, part admiration. "The Billy Holcomb buyout is complete," Lyle announced. "We now own his entire portfolio. 237 debts, totaling roughly $3 million. How much of that is collectible? At fair interest rates with reasonable repayment terms. Maybe 60%. The rest are people who genuinely can't pay. Forgive those. Offer reasonable payment plans to the others." Lyle nodded. "You realize you just absorbed a $3 million loss to prove a point about ethical lending, right?" "I realize. And you're okay with that?" Van thought about Sophie's smile when he'd shown up for dinner, about Sherry's growing trust, about the way his city felt slightly less violent, slightly more human. "Yes," Van said, "I'm okay with that. You're either the most idealistic gangster I've ever met, or the most pragmatic idealist. I haven't figured out which. Maybe I'm both." Lyle sat down across from Van. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I might not answer." "What happens when Sophie grows up, when she's old enough to understand what you really do? What you've done? You can hide the violence from a 7-year-old, but eventually she'll figure it out." Van had thought about this question constantly. Sophie would grow older, would learn about the world, would eventually discover that the man who ate dinner with her family was the same man who'd built an empire on violence and fear. "I don't know," Van admitted. "But I hope that by then, I'll have done enough good to balance the bad. That she'll understand people are complicated, that we contain multitudes. That's a lot to ask from a kid. It's a lot to ask from anyone. But Sophie's smart. She'll figure out who I am eventually. When that happens, I'll tell her the truth and hope she doesn't hate me for it." Lyle stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Van, I think what you're doing is good. Probably won't end well, these things never do, but it's good." After Lyle left, Van sat alone with his thoughts and his phone. He pulled up the message thread with Sherry. Their texts over the past weeks had evolved from practical coordination to something more personal. Comments about Sophie's day, complaints about her job at Dominic's, small observations about ordinary life. Van typed, "Dinner this weekend?" The response came quickly. "Sophie will be thrilled. She's been asking about you. So have I. Honestly." Van stared at that last sentence. So have I, honestly. What did that mean? Was Sherry expressing casual interest or something deeper? Van had no framework for understanding these kinds of interpersonal signals. He could read threat assessments and power dynamics, but emotional subtext was foreign territory. He typed back, "See you Saturday," because acknowledging Sherry's comment felt too complicated. Saturday arrived with spring weather that painted the city in gold and green. Van drove to the Riverside District apartment, parking a block away and walking the final distance. No security detail, no weapons, just Van in jeans and a shirt visiting friends for dinner. Friends. The word still felt strange. Sophie met him at the door wearing a yellow dress that reminded Van of the muddy, torn one she'd been wearing the day they met. This one was new, clean, unmarked by trauma. Mr. Doyle. Mama made your favorite. I have a favorite? Spaghetti. You ate 3 helpings last time. Van hadn't realized anyone had noticed, but Sophie noticed everything. Inside, the apartment had continued its transformation into a home. New pictures hung on the walls, photographs of Sophie and Sherry, some professional, some candid. A bookshelf now held not just Sophie's children's books, but adult novels, suggesting Sherry had time and peace of mind for leisure reading. Sherry emerged from the kitchen, and Van's breath caught slightly. She'd done something different with her hair, wore a dress instead of her usual casual clothes. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance, and everything to do with happiness radiating from someone who'd found safety after living in constant fear. You're staring, Sherry said, but she was smiling. You look good, happy. I am happy, genuinely, surprisingly happy. She moved closer, lowering her voice so Sophie wouldn't hear. Patrick cleared me for full duty at work. I'm managing evening shifts at Dominic's now. The staff actually listens to me. I'm good at this, Van. Really good. I know. That's why I hired you. You hired me because you felt guilty and wanted to help. I hired you because you're capable and needed a job. The guilt was a bonus. They ate dinner with Sophie, chattering about school, about a boy named Max who'd pulled her hair during recess, about a science project she was working on about butterflies. After dinner, Sophie went to her room to finish homework, leaving Van and Sherry alone at the table with coffee and the comfortable silence of people who'd grown accustomed to each other's presence. Can I ask you something? Sherry said finally. Yes. What happens to us? I mean long term. Are we going to live under your protection forever? Is Sophie going to grow up knowing the man who visits us for dinner is actually the most dangerous person in the city? Van had known this conversation was coming. I don't have a clear answer. I'm making this up as I go. That's honest. Terrifying, but honest. What do you want to happen? Sherry considered the question. I want Sophie to have a normal life, school, friends, college eventually. I want her to not be afraid all the time like I was. I want her to believe the world can be good. And for yourself? I want stability, purpose, to prove that surviving wasn't just luck, that I can actually build something. You're doing all of that because you made it possible. And I'm grateful, Van. Truly. But I also need to know this isn't temporary. That you won't wake up one day and decide protecting us is inconvenient. Van reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture surprised them both. Sherry, I can't promise nothing will ever threaten you. My world is dangerous, and being connected to me creates risks. But I can promise that as long as I'm alive, Sophie and you will be protected. And if you're not alive, I've made arrangements. Nicholas has instructions and resources. If something happens to me, you'll be taken care of. Sherry's eyes filled with tears. You've thought that far ahead? I think everything through. It's how I've survived this long. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Planning for your own death so your friends will be okay. Friends? Van repeated, testing the word. Is that what we are? Sherry squeezed his hand. I think we might be, which is insane considering you're Van Doyle and I'm nobody. But yes, I think we're friends. From Sophie's room came singing, off-key but joyful. Both adults turned toward the sound, smiling. She never sang in our old apartment, Sherry said softly. It wasn't safe enough to be that happy. Now she sings all the time. That's good. It's because of you. It's because of both of us. You're the one raising her, loving her, giving her stability. I just cleared the path. You're selling yourself short. I'm being realistic. They sat in comfortable silence, hands still clasped, listening to Sophie's singing drift from her room. Van realized with sudden clarity that this ordinary moment, in an ordinary apartment with ordinary people, was what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not power, not fear, not empire. Just this. Connection. purpose beyond himself, the feeling that his existence made someone else's life better instead of worse. "Van," Sherry said quietly. "Thank you. For stopping that day. For listening to Sophie. For caring when you didn't have to. You've thanked me before. I'll probably thank you 1,000 more times. Get used to it." Van smiled. Actually smiled. Not the cold calculation that sometimes moved his face, but genuine warmth. His phone buzzed. A text from Nicholas. "Christopher is complying with rules. Fernando is complying. All major operators are in line. The city is stable." Van read it and felt something he'd rarely experienced. Satisfaction. Not from destroying an enemy or winning a territory dispute, but from building something that worked. "Everything okay?" Sherry asked. "Everything's good. Better than good, actually." Sophie emerged from her room, homework completed, and declared it was time for a movie. The three of them settled on the couch, Sophie between Van and Sherry, watching some animated film about talking animals. Van didn't follow the plot. He just sat there, Sophie leaning against his side, Sherry's presence warm beside him, and let himself feel something he'd thought impossible. Peace. Belonging. Home. When the movie ended, Sophie had fallen asleep against Van's shoulder. Sherry carefully lifted her daughter and carried her to bed. Van waited in the living room, unsure if he should leave or stay. Sherry returned and sat beside him on the couch. "She asks about you every day. Wants to know when you're coming back, what you're doing. If you're okay, what do you tell her?" "Tell her that you're busy, that you care about us, that you'll visit when you can." Sherry paused. "She thinks you're a hero, you know. Sophie's decided that you're the good guy who saves people." "I'm not a good guy." "No, but you're good to us. For Sophie, that's the same thing." Van knew he should explain the truth that he'd hurt people, killed people, built an empire on violence and fear. That being good to one family didn't erase decades of being bad to countless others. But looking at Sherry's face, seeing the trust and something that might be affection, Van couldn't bring himself to destroy the fragile thing they'd built. "I should go," Van said, standing. "It's late." Sherry walked him to the door. "Saturday dinners are becoming a tradition. You know that, right?" "I'm okay with tradition." "Good, because Sophie's already planning next week's menu. Apparently we're having tacos." Van smiled. "I can handle tacos." At the door, Sherry did something unexpected. She reached up and kissed his cheek, the gesture quick but meaningful. "That was for being you," she said. "The complicated, dangerous, surprisingly kind version of you that showed up when we needed someone." Van didn't know how to respond. Physical affection wasn't something he'd experienced much in his adult life. Business transactions, strategic alliances, fear-based respect, these he understood. But simple human warmth from someone who expected nothing in return felt foreign and overwhelming. "Good night, Sherry," he managed. "Good night, Van." He left before the moment could become more complicated, before he could say something that revealed how much these simple dinners had come to mean to him. In his car, Van sat for a long moment before starting the engine. His phone showed 17 missed calls and 38 unread messages. Business never stopped, problems never paused just because he was having dinner with friends. But for 3 hours, Van had been someone besides the city's most dangerous man. He'd been someone's friend. Sophie's protector. A person who mattered not because of power but because of presence. And that felt more valuable than anything he'd built in 20 years of calculated violence. Van drove back to his penthouse. Back to the fortress that had never felt like home. But something had shifted. The emptiness felt more pronounced now, the isolation more deliberate. He'd spent 2 decades building walls to keep people out, keep emotions contained, keep vulnerability locked away. But Sophie and Sherry had found cracks in those walls, had slipped through defenses Van hadn't even realized were permeable. And instead of feeling threatened by that intrusion, Van felt grateful. Tomorrow he'd return to being Van Doyle, the man who enforced rules through fear and maintained order through controlled violence. But tonight, he'd been someone different, someone better, and that was enough. Epilogue. 6 months of peace. 6 months later, the city had settled into its new normal. Operators followed Van's rules not because they loved them, but because violating them had proven expensive and dangerous. The underground lending economy still existed, but it operated with constraints that made it less predatory, less brutal. Van sat in his office, reviewing quarterly reports, when Lyle entered with news. "Billy Holcomb is dead," Lyle announced. "Heart attack, apparently. Found him this morning in his apartment." Van looked up. "Natural causes?" "According to the medical examiner. But he'd been drinking heavily for months, eating poorly, not taking care of himself. After you bought out his operation, he spiraled." Van felt nothing about Billy's death. No satisfaction, no regret, just the neutral acknowledgement that a problem had resolved itself. "What about his remaining assets?" "Mostly liquidated. Some property that's in legal limbo. Nothing that concerns us." After Lyle left, Van sat alone with his thoughts. 6 months ago, Billy had been a problem requiring management. Now he was just a name in a report, a reminder that power was temporary and control was an illusion. Van's phone buzzed. A text from Sophie. "Mr. Doyle? I got an A on my science project. Mama says you can come celebrate if you want." Van smiled and typed back, "I'll be there for dinner. Congratulations." The response was immediate. "Yay, we're having tacos." Van pocketed his phone and stood, looking out at the city he'd spent 20 years claiming. From up here, it still looked peaceful, ordered, beautiful in its own way. But Van knew the truth. Down there in the streets, people were still struggling, still making desperate choices, still trying to survive in a world that rarely cared about their suffering. He couldn't save everyone, but he could save some, and he could make sure that the people he did save got the chance to build lives worth living. Van grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He had dinner with friends, a tradition he'd come to treasure more than anything else in his complicated life. Sophie would tell him about her science project. Sherry would update him on restaurant management. They'd eat tacos and laugh at Sophie's jokes and pretend for a few hours that Van was just a normal person visiting normal friends. And that pretense, that brief escape from being the monster everyone feared, had become the most real part of Van's life. He'd spent 20 years building an empire. Now he was learning to build something more valuable. A life worth living. A purpose beyond power. A future that included more than just survival. It wasn't redemption. Van had done too much, hurt too many people, caused too much damage to ever be truly redeemed. But it was better, and better was enough. So, dear viewers, as we come to the end of Van and Sophie's story, I want to ask you something. Is a monster who protects the innocent still a monster, or does choosing mercy even once change everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear what you think. And hey, if this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Now, this is actually my first time posting a Mafia story on this channel. I've always done werewolf content, so I'm curious, did you enjoy this different direction? Should I create more stories like Van's, or do you want me to stick to the werewolves? Let me know in the comments. Your feedback shapes what I create next.